Hi, welcome back guys. This is your friend, the MHA What If with another fanfiction. This is the move of What If Deku Blamed Kacchan? All credits for this video go to their respective authors, so please support the real author. Check out the link in the description for more details. Please give this video a like and subscribe to the channel if you want more videos like this. Now let's get into the fanfic. Shortly after being diagnosed quirkless, Izuku realized that he wasn't on equal footing with most of his peers. He didn't have the same kinds of gifts they had more power than him and didn't hesitate to show it. Izuku was quick to accept that that was simply how the world worked. His mother was a different matter, however. When Izuku was 7 and he came home with bruises and burns more often than not, his mother had had enough. I told you it's just how the others play," Izuku insisted, because he really didn't like the tears in his mother's eyes. "Izuku," she said softly, gently stroking strands of hair away from his forehead, which Izuku knew was purple from where Akatani had hit him with a quirk that made him able to turn his hands into large metal pipes at will. Izuku thought it was a really interesting quirk and wished he could observe it more closely. When he had asked for a demonstration, however, Akatani decided to demonstrate it on him. Which was okay, really. At least he actually listened to Izuku and even complied. It was Izuku's fault for not telling him that he shouldn't demonstrate it on him. He told his mother that much, which he realized was a mistake when some of the shiny drops of water in her eyes overflowed and started rolling down her cheeks. Her shoulders were beginning to shake, and Izuku could feel the tremors in her hands from where they were placed on his shoulder. "Mom!" Izuku yelled, panicked. She wasn't hurt, was she? He looked at her more closely, not just at her face but at her light blue shirt and black breaths too. She was kneeling before his chair on the floor so that she could better bandage and disinfect the burn on his wrist he had gotten for being in Kacchan's way. She was almost done too. Izuku knew by now that the only remaining step was putting everything back in their right places in the first aid kit next to her. Which meant that she wouldn't have to be on the hard floor for much longer, right? That couldn't be it. But her clothes or skin weren't torn or bloody either. "What's wrong?" he asked, lifting a hand to squeeze one of her hands on his shoulder like his mother sometimes did when he was crying. That was probably the wrong thing to do because it made her sob more. "I'm sorry," she hiccuped. "I'm so sorry, Izuku." Izuku shook his head. He didn't know what was going on. He could feel the wetness on his own cheeks, which meant that he was probably crying too. He didn't like seeing people cry because it usually meant that they weren't happy. And what he wanted the most was for everyone, especially his mom, to be happy. He needed to fix this. "Are you sick?" He leaned forward a bit and reached out to place his palm on his mom's forehead. It wasn't too warm. She shook her head and looked him in the eyes while taking a deep, uneven breath. "I'm sad." She must have seen his confusion, because she explained further right after, "I'm sad that you're hurt." He could feel his eyes widen. That was when he fully realized that she was crying because of what he had told her. Because of the bruises and burns. He knew that she was usually out of sorts when she saw them, but he hadn't thought that all those loud, painful, uncontrollable sobs could have been caused by something like that. They seemed to have erupted right out of her, like the lava from the volcano he had seen that one time on Kids' Tips. He didn't understand. His mom smiled and gently pressed the ice pack back against his forehead. It was a bit cold, but it helped ease the throbbing he could still feel there. His mom's hand was still shaking, her entire body was, but her breaths seemed just a bit less as if she had been forced to be without air for a long time, like he knew he had sounded that one time Kacchan and his friends had wanted to test how long a quirkless person could last underwater. She still looked unhappy. "I'm not hurt anymore," he said, smiling slightly. He lifted his right arm, where the burn was, demonstratively. "See? I can move it and all." He moved his hands and fingers quickly in all the directions he could manage. It was the truth. His wrist pulsed with warmth, but he could smile through it like all might. "And my head is the same." He didn't start shaking it because that would surely disturb the ice she held there, but he smiled even wider. He beamed when his mother's smile seemed just a bit less strained at that. He wondered why her eyes still seemed so sad to him, though. "Oh, Izuku." She put the ice pack back on the floor and gently pulled him closer to herself to wrap her arms around him. He stood up so that he could put his own arms around her back too, letting his head sink onto her fluffy shoulder. "I love you so much, my baby," she whispered, tightening her arms around him. "I love you too," he said. Then he whispered something else that seemed very important to say. "Please don't be sad anymore, Mom. I swear I'm not hurt." She let out a muffled noise into his shoulder which Izuku wasn't sure was a sob or a laugh and hugged him tighter. He hoped this meant that she believed him and wouldn't be sad because of him. The next day she didn't go away after dropping him off at school like she usually did. Instead, she told him that she had made an appointment to talk to his homeroom teacher about something. Before he had the chance to ask what they would be discussing, she was gone. He could understand that she didn't want to be late to the appointment, so he let her go without a fuss. He would ask her when he got home. He found out a bit earlier, though, when his teacher pulled him aside after their lesson during their 10-minute break. He didn't mind much, because he didn't like breaks anyway, but that didn't mean he wasn't shaking with nervousness. "Izuku," she said with one of those smiles that made him feel uncomfortable. "I talked to your mother this morning." She spoke in her usual sweet voice like she always did when reprimanding him for bothering his classmates. "She told me you were being hurt by your classmates. Is that true?" He shook his head quickly. "I told her we were playing. She would understand since she always let them play like that." "I see." She nodded with a smile as if she had been expecting that. "I would punish them dash." "No," Izuku said before he could stop himself. He ducked his head in shame when he realized that he had just rudely interrupted his teacher. "I'm sorry." "That's okay, Izuku." He stiffened and looked up at her when her hand touched his shoulder. But her grip wasn't tight and she didn't seem angry. She had a content look on her face. "I don't want to reprimand them, but I think your mom will only be happy if I do." She shook her head sadly. "I can tell her." He thought about it for a moment, but it didn't take him long to realize what to do to make his classmates, his mom and his teacher stop being sad. "I can tell her that you punished them. But you don't have to actually do it." "Are you sure, Izuku?" his teacher asked, looking concerned. Izuku felt guilty for not liking her much before, because she seemed to worry a lot for her students, even when it wasn't necessary. "I couldn't ask that of you." "Yes, I'm sure," he answered, determined to make everyone happy. He knew it was the right decision when he saw the pleased smile on his teacher's face. It was okay to lie if it was for the right reasons, he decided. This theory was confirmed when his mom seemed a lot more relaxed after he told her that his classmates started playing with him without injuries. He still got hurt, of course, he was too weak not to, but he didn't show it to his mom. The bruise on his head had been an exception. Most of his injuries could be hidden under his uniform. He felt guilty about lying to her, but when he realized that his mom smiled a lot more and cried a lot less now, he knew that he should have stopped showing her his injuries a lot earlier. He was big enough to take care of them by himself. And what hero makes people cry? He would be fine. He asked for money for his birthday under the guise of saving it for the limited edition All Might figurine that would be released in September, which was super cool, but in reality he spent it on first aid supplies. His mom thought he was mature for thinking ahead, so she didn't need much convincing. He bought one of the new cheap mass-produced figurines, knowing that his mom wouldn't know the difference, and saved the rest of the money for later in case he needed to buy more supplies for his injuries. Which was very likely with how quickly Kacchan's quirk was improving. His explosions really were super cool. Even though he was glad that he had stopped making his mom sad, he felt like there was something missing now. He knew that his mom didn't know it, but he was reluctantly building a wall between them. And even though it was one to keep his mom safe, it put some distance between them. He used to tell his mom everything without much restraint, the things that he couldn't tell his classmates when he only smiled or cried but endured the hits and burns without much resistance. He used to tell her that he was scared of Kacchan's explosions even though he thought his quirk was super amazing, that he didn't like the pain that much sometimes even if he knew that that was just how things were, that he was sad that he was quirkless because he wished he could be strong enough to really be friends the way the others were friends. He could have said all of these things to his classmates, but he knew from experience that they would have dismissed them or made fun of him for such thoughts. His mom, on the other hand, used to put her arms around him, tell him that it wasn't his fault, that everything would be all right and that he was strong and not useless. Even if he hadn't really believed her, it felt good to be listened to be told those things. It felt just as good to be able to talk about them. But that wasn't worth his mom's happiness. So he kept quiet. He distracted himself from his stupid feelings by focusing on his dream of becoming a hero. He didn't give himself much of a chance to really think about how impossible that was by constantly analyzing different quirks and heroes even more than before. Perhaps it was because he didn't really have people to talk to that he developed his annoying habit of muttering his thoughts out loud sometimes. Despite knowing that he would be in more pain because of it, he couldn't control it. He really wished he wouldn't bother people that much. Even though he had his analysis to distract him, there was still this painful lack of something weighing on him when he was alone in his room with all of his homework done and nothing new to add to his notebooks. Those times, there were instances when he couldn't stop himself from crying even though there really was no reason for it. He wasn't being told mean things or burnt when he was alone, after all. He should really stop being such a crybaby or his mom would notice, either now or later when she saw his swollen eyes. That only made him cry harder, because he sometimes felt like the only thing he was good for was making people sad, angry, or disappointed, and he really didn't want his mom to be any of those things. He put his hands over his mouth to muffle his sobs. He was almost a middle schooler, he really should be over this. Izuku! He startled when the door opened. Are you okay? He had forgotten how thin their walls were. He nodded quickly, pressing his hands tighter over his mouth, the snot on them making them wet. Are you sure, honey? His mom asked, sitting down next to him on the bed. Fine, Mom. His voice was muffled and shaky and he hated it. You can talk to me about anything, you know. His mom said with a kind smile. He removed his hands and took a few deep breaths, her hand on his shoulder making it just a bit easier to do so. He turned his head in her direction. I'm fine, Mom. He hoped his smile was convincing. I'm just worried about the English exam tomorrow. He felt a twinge of guilt when she didn't hesitate to believe him and reassured him that he would do well. He didn't much feel like he deserved her comfort after deceiving her like that. Next time, he vowed to himself, I'll find a way to deal with this without worrying her. And he did. He put his hands over his mouth before he even let the tears fall, clenching his mouth shut tightly. His frustration at himself resulted in him accidentally biting the flesh of his lips, hard. But he didn't care, he couldn't hurt his mom, not again. He remembered vividly how much her shoulders had shaken and how painful her sobs had been even though it had happened all those years ago. Even when his lip and the skin under it started to hurt, he didn't stop pressing his mouth shut. The pain grounded him. It distracted him from the hollow feeling in his chest and the churning in his stomach that was caused by unnecessary fear. This pain helped, he realized, because it had a purpose of its own. It wasn't like being hurt by his classmates for the right reasons and being in pain as an unwelcome side effect. This was different. He had never encountered this kind of pain before, but it was useful. The marks it left behind on his face weren't, however. He could explain them away easily once by saying it happened in his sleep, but he knew he had to find a better method for next time. And next time would come soon, Izuku knew, because he felt like crying at home a lot despite all the crying he did at school. No wonder no one really liked him apart from his mom. Despite the fact that the helpful pain theory was kind of new, Izuku had an idea of what he could do about it. He had a lot of time to read articles on various different topics, which came in handy for solving the issue. He wasn't unaware of so-called unhealthy coping mechanisms like using razor blades to handle your emotions. The article he had read about it was meant to provide people an opportunity to educate themselves on the topic and not in any way encourage anyone to try it themselves. He had never thought that he himself would resort to self-harming, considering that he had enjoyed neither being in pain nor the hassle of taking care of his injuries later. But biting himself when he was about to cry had helped. And at this point, he was willing to do anything to reduce the number of people he was burdening even if it was just by one. His mom deserved better. Izuku took a deep breath as he pushed open the door to the convenience store. It wasn't one he or his mother had ever been to before as far as he was aware. It wasn't one that he ever planned to return to after this either. He walked the aisles, trying to keep his nervousness in check while looking around for where what he was looking for could be. He stopped occasionally to examine one thing or the other, trying to look like he was calmly browsing through things. No one would remember him, he told himself logically. The store was full of people at this time of the day, and buying razor blades wasn't an unusual thing to do. Even if he was someone who looked years away from actually having to use them. He shook his head to clear those thoughts away and quickened his pace. He had planned for that. He should stop wasting time trying to look normal and get back on track. The basket in his right hand contained some supplies only women had any use for, which meant that buying this wouldn't be suspicious amongst those. He was just a boy helping out his parents. While in reality he was just a boy helping himself. He was selfish. Perhaps it was because of his nervousness, or maybe the shaving utensils were just meant to be difficult to find, but it took a while to get to the right aisle. He busied himself with pretending to read some product information on the back of some anti-aging face mask on one of the shelves nearby while waiting for the middle-aged woman to leave the shaving area. It luckily didn't take too long. He was careful to walk calmly, not wanting to show the multitude of swirl of emotions inside of him. Feeling anxious was to be expected, but feeling almost giddy with excitement really wasn't. He would examine the implications of that later on. He was on a mission. And despite his fears, he liked having a mission. Note to self, razor blades are rare and hard to find. He was sure to remember that for the future. He only managed to find one small pack of them, and he wasn't even sure if it was the kind he was looking for. What was he even looking for? He hadn't prepared enough for this. After checking several times, Izuku concluded that these really were the only razor blades offered by the store. He dropped them into his basket. He couldn't stop his hands from shaking as he hurriedly put the products in his backpack after clumsily handing the money to a clerk who had barely paid him a glance, luckily. He quickly walked out of the store, already thinking about how he should proceed from now on. Despite having bought the blades, he didn't actually plan on using them unless absolutely necessary. It was just nice to know that he had something available when things got bad enough that he would hurt his mom without using them. If he didn't want to get hurt, he'd just have to get better at not being a useless crybaby. He just hoped that if worse came to worst, they would work. It didn't take very long for that to happen. He should have known, considering that he was aware of many of his faults and limits even if he didn't usually give off that impression. And being unable to stop himself from crying when or before his mom was home was definitely one of them. "Do we have warm water already, Mom?" He yelled from his room into the kitchen, where his mom was busy preparing dinner. He took out a shirt and a fresh pair of comfortable sweatpants from his closet. He must have sounded casual and calm enough because his mom answered his question without further inquiries. That was good. After placing his change of clothes next to the sink, he locked the door and let the water run. He removed the pack of razor blades from his right pocket with a shaking hand. He checked whether the door was locked again and sat down on the closed toilet lid. The hand clutching the small package was shaking as much as his knees. His entire body was. His breathing was quick, his throat too tight. He was about to cry. He knew that, and he might not be able to stop it. But he needed to try. He clumsily started tearing into the paper that the blades were in. By the time dark-colored pieces of carton were scattered on the bathroom tiles under the toilet, Izuku was left with a white cuboidal box in his right hand. It was just small enough to comfortably fit in his palm. Izuku took a deep breath. He wouldn't cry. This would help. Working out how to get one of the razor blades out of the box would have been easier without shaking fingers, but it didn't take very long. The blade was wrapped in white, thin piece of paper. He removed it carefully and stared. Was it normal for it to be so thin? And malleable? He was able to easily bend the blade. He didn't do it, but it looked like he'd be able to break it in half if he tried. It was okay. He made himself breathe deeply again. Now on to the next step. Izuku had planned this. He had needed to plan this. He placed the blade and the white box on the sink and got undressed. He knew how to get rid of blood on his clothes, but it was easier and less risky if he didn't have to do it. When he was done, he was back to sitting on the toilet lid in nothing but his boxers, holding the thin blade in his right hand. The hole in the middle made it difficult to hold properly. The blade didn't look like it could withstand even Izuku's quirkless hands if he wanted to break it. How could something so breakable break his skin? He blinked rapidly, trying not to let any tears fall. Was he really doing this? He let the blade hover a few inches over his left thigh. He was useless already, and this would make him even weaker. He knew that. But then again, there wasn't really much room for him to move even lower on the scale of those weaknesses. And hurting his mom was a lot worse than having proof of his own failures. He awkwardly pressed the blade against his skin. He knew what the next step was. His hand was shaking, heart beating with anxiety. He looked away and stared at the shelf on the opposite wall. Unbidden, the memory of Kacchan telling him he was useless for not even trying to fight back resurfaced. It had been a while since he tried to defend himself against the people at school. He knew it wasn't playing by now. His classmates had reminded him of that many times, but for some reason this was the first time Kacchan had decided to comment on that particular aspect of his behavior. He moved the blade, careful to keep it pressed down, knowing it would only work then. He did it slowly. It stung a bit but didn't hurt much. When he looked back at his leg, he could see a thin red line there with 3 small droplets of blood on top of it. They moved and darkened his skin like strongly pigmented teardrops, so much that Izuku's hand rose to feel the skin under his eye. His face was dry. He knew he hadn't pushed the blade deep into his skin, not knowing how much damage the force he applied would cause. He pressed the blade right below the red line and moved it horizontally again, a bit quicker this time. The sting was sharper. There was a bit more blood too. You can't even lift a finger against any of those extras, Deku. Kacchan sneered. He did it again. You want to be a hero? He had an unkind grin on his face. You're more useless than the useless. He moved the blade quicker and pressed it just a bit deeper into his skin. You can't do anything. He had cut again, he noted, drawn out of his memory. He looked back down at his thigh. The 2 newest cuts, the ones that were closer to his knee, seemed to be just a bit deeper, judging by the amount of blood they were releasing. It wasn't too much, not nearly as much as the red on his skin that one time Tamaki had cut him with his long, sharp spikes. But the blade was sharp too. Perhaps that was why it was so thin. He placed it on the floor and bent down to take out a bit of gauze and the disinfectant from his secret first aid kit. He had been too desperate to think about disinfecting the blade, but he could at least mitigate the damage somewhat by properly cleaning his wounds now. When he sat up straighter again with the gauze, some toilet paper and the disinfectant in his hands, he realized that the blood from some of the cuts was slowly trickling down the left side of his thigh. It hadn't started dripping onto the floor yet, but it was close to reaching the edge of his thigh. Izuku immediately moved to clean up the trails of blood and the blood on his leg with the toilet paper. He wouldn't waste too many of his first aid kit tools on this. Then he sprayed some disinfectant on the wounds. It stung a bit and made the blood more fluid, but he was used to that pain by now after years of tending to his own injuries. And these definitely didn't come close to the worst of them. But that he had to admit that there was something calming about watching the drops of blood gather on top of the dark red gaping little tears of his skin. There was a knock on his door. Izuku startled enough to almost drop the disinfectant. Izuku? Dinner's ready. I'm coming. He yelled back through the noise of the running water. Hurry up before the food gets cold. He waited for his mom's footsteps to fade, before continuing with the second part of his plan, the aftermath actions. He was quick to wrap his wounds in gauze and bandages, spurred on by the prospect of having a delicious meal with his mom. His actual shower could wait. After washing his hands and the blade, he rewrapped the piece of alloy in the paper and put it back in the white box. Satisfied with the result, he packed the white box away with his first aid supplies. He got dressed in his fresh set of comfortable clothes and hid the first aid kit in the ones he had taken off. Once the box was stowed away in the back of his closet beneath several layers of clothing, Izuku hurried into the kitchen. There was a smile on his face when he ate his meal and talked to his mom. He didn't feel the urge to cry anymore. The cutting was more effective than he had anticipated. It was also the potential cause of some headaches and lightheadedness at times, but that was a small price to pay for all the ways it helped. And it did that a lot. It helped make him better in many ways despite making him worse in some others. He never cried at home anymore. He did it at school sometimes. He wasn't brave enough to bring something that could be considered a weapon with him to school, but even there it was less frequent. He could endure the pain and beatings more easily knowing that he had his blades at home. Just the thought of them was comforting. He knew it didn't make a lot of sense, logically. Why should the promise of being in pain help him deal with being in pain? He had read somewhere that those two situations were different because of the feeling of control that came with being the one inflicting the pain on himself, but when he looked at the situation from an outside perspective, he knew it was irrational. He had done some research on self-harming both before and after he started doing it himself. And despite all the warnings and tips on how to stop, Izuku didn't feel inclined to do so in any way. This was the most useful thing he could do for everyone in his life, including himself. The blades were hidden in a drawer along with a razor that the blades could be used for. He had bought it only to be able to explain why he had a box full of razor blades should his mom accidentally find them. His plan was to say that he had bought them in order to be prepared for when it would eventually happen. It wasn't so hard to believe. He had done weirder things in the past. This way, he was just a bit less anxious about his mom finding out. That didn't mean he didn't buy tattoo cover-up, just in case he had to show his thighs for some reason. Like at a doctor's appointment, for example. It didn't work too well, sadly. He had tested it, but no matter how much he put on, the scars and wounds were still faintly visible. And his clothes had gotten dirty from the makeup. It was better for hiding the bruises he got at school, probably because while the discolored patches of skin were usually swollen, they were less uneven than cuts. Luckily, there wasn't much of a need to cover up his cuts with makeup. Even his swim trunks were long enough to hide them since he was never cutting anywhere other than on his thighs. By the end of his first semester of middle school, Izuku had developed a routine of sorts. He cut himself, showered, took care of all his injuries from the day, not just the self-inflicted ones, placed the used utensils in a plastic bag and went back to his room to quickly put everything back to its right place. The plastic bag with the bloody pieces of toilet paper, gauze and other incriminating trash was stowed in his school bag beneath all his other stuff. He usually threw that away on his way to school in a random trash can, never the same one twice in a row. Sometimes he ended up not finding a suitable trash can, either because there were too many people around or because he didn't have time for one reason or another. It made him fidgety with nervousness, knowing that he had proof of his activity so easily accessible to anyone who looked through his bag. It wasn't an unfounded concern. In the past, there were several times when some of his classmates had emptied his bag to look through his stuff with the goal of making fun of anything he had, somehow managing to come to conclusions about him based on what he had with him. "You don't have a lunchbox?" Kobayashi had snickered one time. "Your mom must have realized you weren't worth the effort." The other people around had joined in his laughter. The constant knot of anxiety in his stomach usually made it too hard to eat at school. When he tried to eat his lunch, something always seemed to go wrong and he ended up with more food on his uniform than in his stomach. Another time Kacchan had searched his bag to check for stuff that indicated that he hadn't given up on his dream of becoming a hero yet. He'd made fun of him for his notebook and all-might eraser. It hadn't been too bad. And he hadn't done a bag search ever since. Izuku just hoped he wouldn't do one today. His mom wasn't feeling well and he'd stayed a bit longer to help her as much he could. She must have caught a virus. It was that time of the year. She had a fever, a runny nose, a sore throat and a stomachache, basically the whole package. And she'd just expected him to leave. In the end she'd had to physically push him out of their apartment to get him moving. Deku! Izuku'd never been too lucky and it was proven yet again when Kacchan cornered him at the tunnel on his way home. He must have been following him, seeing as Izuku took a detour in a less populated area to get home. He usually checked for people following him, but he'd been too eager to finally get rid of the evidence of his weaknesses and the fear pulsating through his entire body. He should have been more careful. It had been stupid of him. He took a deep, steadying breath after Kacchan had shoved him against the wall of the tunnel. It didn't matter. He'd cut tonight. He tried to slow his breathing even as he flinched at Kacchan's right hand aggressively hitting the wall inches away from his head with one of his explosions. It wasn't one of the strong ones, but it wasn't a weak one either. It was the type of explosion that was especially precise, which he liked to use when he was either very calm or very angry. It didn't look good for Izuku. No matter what happened, he could always count on his cutting, he reminded himself. Kacchan pushed his left forearm against Izuku's chest to shove him harder against the wall. No one could take his cutting away from him. He had a surefire way to make this all better, to make all of this not matter at all. He looked up at Kacchan briefly, then back down again. What do you want, Kacchan? He attempted to smile, a weak smile that probably looked more like a grimace. What are you up to, shitty Deku? He asked. Huh. Izuku tilted his head slightly to the left, away from Kacchan's burning hand. Shut up. He pushed Izuku even harder against the wall. Stop lying to me. I'm not stupid. Izuku chanced a glance at the red-eyed boy and regretted it immediately. Kacchan wasn't just angry, he was absolutely livid with eyes shining with something akin to betrayal. This wasn't good. No matter what it was, it'd be over at some point and then… Answer me. He let out an explosion with the palm of his left hand without releasing the tight hold he had on Izuku's right upper arm. Despite having anticipated it, Izuku couldn't stop himself from letting out a choked whining sound from behind his gritted teeth. It never stopped burning less, especially since Kacchan's quirk had gotten better and better over the years. This one wasn't the most painful kind of explosion, but it would leave Izuku with another hole in his uniform and a surface-level burn to take care of. He was glad he'd forgotten to put on his jacket in his hurry to get away. He still needed that to cover up his horrible uniform when coming home. His mom would buy the excuse of the hole being caused by fooling around when it wasn't bloody anymore. She always did. It stung and pulsed in a steady rhythm, occasionally getting worse when Kacchan decided to tighten his grip or move his hand slightly. He bit his lip. This couldn't be more different from his cutting. I don't know. He cursed himself for the way his voice shook, not because of pain but because of stupid fear. He looked back up at Kacchan to anticipate his next move. Izuku's prospects weren't great. The scowl on his childhood friend's face had deepened and his teeth were gritted. You can't even answer a question without crying. Izuku flinched at his raised voice and tightening grip. He hadn't realized he'd been crying. There must be tears in his eyes. You're useless. Abruptly, Izuku was released. The sudden, rough removal of Kacchan's hand sent another flash of pain up his arm, making him take in a few quick breaths to steady himself against the wall again. His reprieve didn't last long. He stiffened when Kacchan raised both his hands, but they only roughly gripped his backpack straps and pulled them off down his arms, further aggravating his wound. Izuku hadn't offered much resistance once he'd realized what was going on, thinking that Kacchan's only goal was to access other parts of his body to injure. He regretted that now when instead of turning back to Izuku, Kacchan started opening the zipper on his backpack. No, wait! Izuku yelled once the flare of pain had subsided enough for him to properly take in his surroundings. He hurried towards Kacchan to get it back before? Shut up, Deku. He shoved him away with a lot of force, and he hit the asphalt with a painful thud. That didn't matter right now. He got to his feet as quickly as he could only to get a clear view of Kacchan holding the backpack upside down, shaking it while all of his belongings tumbled out and scattered on the cold ground. The plastic bag was last, landing on top of his other things unceremoniously. Kacchan stared at the thing with a dumbfounded expression on his face. What the F is that? Before Izuku could answer, he picked it up cautiously to examine it. That it's just stuff, you know? Izuku said lamely, knowing Kacchan wouldn't listen to him anyway. And it was okay. Finding this wouldn't hurt Kacchan, it would only hurt Izuku to hear what he had to say. And that was okay. The contents of the bag dropped to the ground in a collective heap. Izuku felt exposed gazing at the gauze and toilet paper pieces that either had thick, brown lines on them or were soaked entirely in brown. Some were somewhere in the middle, shaped as if a bomb had gone off over lines, with only the edges of the strips of white visible. This was a collection of exclusively cutting-related trash since he hadn't gotten any too severe injuries at school yesterday. Kacchan picked up one of the clearly lined toilet paper pieces and examined it. He held it far away from himself with only two of his fingertips touching an unbloodied part of it. Izuku gulped. Why are you carrying this around? Kacchan growled. As some kind of evidence? He laughed harshly. The school won't care even if you show them a bit of blood. He tossed the paper back on the floor, obviously disgusted. Izuku didn't deny it, because that still sounded better than the truth. Even if this might get him more injuries, it would keep his secret safe and the insults wouldn't hurt that much. Kacchan's uncaring attitude would hurt less if he didn't know. Kacchan threw the rest of his stuff around, probably looking for a hero notebook. Luckily, he'd been too worried about his mom to remember to pack it. The breaks had been a lot more boring that way, but he was glad he didn't have it now. When Kacchan was done, he turned back to glare at Izuku. "You're pathetic. You never defend yourself and then you pull some shit like this." He kicked at the bloody bandages on the floor. They scattered further. "No one will care. Next to me you're nothing." Then, miraculously, Kacchan turned on his heel and walked away without attacking him further, neither verbally nor physically. Izuku released a sigh of relief and sunk to his knees on the floor. He wiped at his face, knowing that it was wet from tears. He took a deep breath to keep himself from outright sobbing. He needed to get home to support his mom. He didn't let himself think about what had just happened even when his injuries strained while collecting everything. His hands were shaking, but nothing particularly bad had happened. His school stuff was dirty from the uncleaned asphalt in the tunnel, but at least it was still functional. His arm ached at every movement and gush of air, but it was manageable especially after the initial moment of putting his jacket on. The bruises he'd gotten weren't painful either. They throbbed continuously but only slightly. It was all fine. But that night Izuku still cut a little deeper than usual. He didn't lose more than just a bit of blood, but there was more blood than usual. After a moment of calm, the blood hurried to cover up the patches of white appearing between his parted layers of skin, probably the dermis, until it overflowed down his leg a lot quicker. It was fascinating and even more satisfying than usual. This was fine. What Kacchan thought didn't matter. What the school thought didn't matter. Everything was fine as long as he could do this. The deeper cuts took a lot longer to heal. They sometimes even bled through his bandages the day after he had cut them. His uniform was black, which was helpful with all the times he got hurt, so it wasn't too problematic. No one at school would question a bloody spot on his leg and his mom wouldn't come in contact with his thighs. The problem with the deeper cuts was the risk they posed to keeping this secret. One time, he abruptly felt the beginning signs of losing consciousness in the middle of cutting. A sudden wave of nausea was soon accompanied by a disorienting headache, dizziness, and loss of vision. He felt farther and farther away from his body until for a while he wasn't in the bathroom at all anymore. Luckily, it didn't take too long for him to snap back into a reality that was still just as painful as it had been before. Despite having fainted in the past, he had no idea what was going on. His breathing sped up in panic and he clumsily tried to grab the toilet paper to clean his wounds. It took a few tries to aim properly, but he knew he succeeded when he felt the paper in his hand. He couldn't faint now. It'd break his mom's heart to find him like this. He was able to stand up and pull up his breathes, but he could feel his vision getting more and more distorted with black dots while his brain felt as if it was shrinking, taking with it his connection to the physical world. He managed to clutch his first aid kit along with the bloody bandages and toilet paper from yesterday and today to his chest while he left the bathroom. The blade was clenched in his fist. He and everything incriminating needed to get to his room. His mom was sleeping off an exhausting day at work. She wouldn't see him. It was hard to find his room and everything became black for a few moments, causing him to collide with his window, which meant he was in the right room, but he was eventually able to drop himself and everything in his hands on the bed and hide them all under the covers. The world didn't stop spinning, but at least he couldn't fall now. It was then, when the urge to hide and get away subsided, that he was able to take in more of what was happening around him. There was a constant knocking sound somewhere, probably outside of his window. Were there construction workers working at this time of night, or was it part of the symptoms he was experiencing? Probably the second option, seeing as the sound petered off after a while. The nausea, the shivers, the dizziness, and even the headache improved quickly, or maybe he just lost track of time. He still felt a subdued sting in his head and a bit sick to his stomach, but he didn't think he was about to faint anymore. He was afraid he would if he got up, though, so he laid there for a while. Now that his thoughts were clearer, he realized how risky his behavior had been. His mom could have been awake. He could have woken her up with the amount of noise his uncontrolled movements had made. He could have walked into the wrong room or bloodied the walls with his unwashed hands. He felt a jolt of panic at that realization. He needed to get up, hide all of his stuff and check the places he walked past before his mom saw. The symptoms weren't gone completely and he was afraid they'd worsen if he stood up, but he needed to do it. It turned out to be the best decision he made all night. He had left a bloody piece of toilet paper and drops of blood on the bathroom floor. Despite feeling dizzy and weak, he hurried to clean it up. His arms and legs were shaky and hard to move, but he was able to do it in the end. Late at night, after everything was cleaned up, including his cuts, and put in its right place, Izuku laid awake in bed. He felt exhausted but unable to sleep. His body was weak and buzzing at the same time. Even his eyes seemed to be shaking. Izuku cursed himself for his stupidity. He had one secret to keep, but he couldn't even do that properly. He vowed to never let something like this happen again. It happened again. After the first incident, Izuku took a break from cutting. It was a short one because he was too weak for anything else, but even a short one made him so much harder to handle. He was able to hold back his crying at home, but by the end of the few days without cutting he felt like he'd burst. All of this confirmed just how abnormal and weak he was. He bet no one else at his school was like this. They weren't only better because they had quirks or because they were physically strong, everything else about them was part of what made them superior to Izuku. By now, these facts had been confirmed too many times to be ignored. And it was fine. It was just how things were. Izuku still cut deep enough to see white sometimes. But he tried to limit his overall number of cuts when he did that. He had researched the potential causes for his fainting episode and had come to the conclusion that it could have potentially been caused by losing too much blood. So if he cut only once, but deep instead of too many times, it wouldn't happen, right? Wrong. This was how he accidentally cut his deepest cut yet. He was pretty sure it needed stitches according to the data he found on the internet, but there was no way he would see a doctor about self-inflicted injuries. It was wide and bleeding a lot quicker than any of his other cuts had in the past. The skin had split so easily, Izuku mused as he pressed a torn shirt against his cut. It must have been because of the scars that had been there beneath it. The scars of his past cuts made his skin more fragile, more breakable, kind of like he himself was. Most of his healed cuts didn't look bad. Some of them looked like scribbles a toddler could have drawn or like thin white scratches, others were a bit thicker, but were still just uneven white lines. A few of them were wider around the middle, closing up around the edges and were blue, violet, pink or red depending on the weather. They itched sometimes and were swollen to different degrees. Those were the places he had cut deep enough to get a glimpse at the dermis like he had done just now. The cut was still bleeding when Izuku wrapped gauze around it, and it continued to do so even while he cleaned up, got dressed, and went to his room. This time, the gradually worsening symptoms were manageable. He felt nauseous and physically weak, but he was in bed already, and everything was cleaned up and packed away. He wrapped several tight layers of gauze around his wound and wore black sweatpants to bed. The nausea was less severe than last time, but it lasted longer. As did the bleeding. But eventually both got better and the incident became just another time he cut himself deeper than usual. It was fine. He hadn't actually fainted yet. And cutting deeper felt better, not just because it hurt more, but also because he felt more useful. He should at least be doing the cutting right. If he was too weak to cut himself deep enough to leave proper scars instead of cat scratches, what was he good for? He felt a sick sense of accomplishment whenever he looked at the scars of what he had done. It was the only time he truly felt like that, and he wouldn't ever give it up, despite knowing how abnormal he was. He would never let anyone find out. Cutting was like painting a picture. Not romantically or glamorously, but in an incriminating, characterizing way. The painting on Izuku's thighs showed his useless and pathetic nature. He wouldn't ever be able to get rid of the paint once it's dry, but he'd keep on adding layers because it was his only piece of art. After he got All Might's quirk, the frequency of his cutting decreased. He still did it several times a week, but he was too exhausted from his training and distracted enough to not think about it too often. After starting at UA, his paranoia about anyone finding out about his habit increased. For one, he ended up in Recovery Girl's office often enough, luckily never with any injuries on his thighs. For another, there were people who seemed genuinely concerned whenever he got injured. And he didn't want to hurt people just because he was unable to control himself, so he wore long boxers every day. He didn't want to be suspicious by changing in a changing cubicle like he had done back in middle school. This was a fresh start and he wouldn't disappoint or harm his newly acquired friends. And All Might? Well, he had already told him several times to stop it with the waterworks. What would he think if he knew that he cried so much despite trying to control himself? What would he think if he found out how useless his vessel truly was? All Might was kind. He wouldn't say anything to Izuku's face. But Izuku knew he wasn't actually good enough to be his successor. His thighs were proof of that. He was selfish. So selfish. And the most selfish thing he'd ever done was accepting All Might's quirk. He needed to keep his secret. It would be a lot easier since he didn't have to hide injuries he got from his bullies anymore. It would be fine. And it was. Until Kacchan blasted a wall and left him with an injury somewhere he never wanted to have, one that wasn't inflicted by him. Midoriya, I've been looking for you. Midoriya startles, stops in his tracks, and turns to look at him. Todoroki, how is your leg? Midoriya hasn't taken off his gym uniform yet. Shoto spotted him for the first time since Heroics training when he returned to Heights Alliance a few minutes ago. My? What are? Midoriya sputters. His hands are moving in all kinds of directions like they usually do when people ask him questions that make him nervous. Shoto doesn't understand why he's doing it now. Perhaps he misunderstood. He should clarify. You injured your leg in the exercise today. He explains calmly. When Bakugo blasted that wall, a metal pipe fell on your leg. Midoriya smiles. My leg's fine. He chuckles nervously. His gaze is trained on the floor. By now, his eyes are only occasionally flicking up to look at Shoto. I moved out of the way before I was hit badly. Oh. He must have seen it wrong then. That's good. It's the right thing to say apparently, because Midoriya seems a lot more cheerful when he replies, "Thank you for worrying, Todoroki. You're a good friend." It's not long before they part ways after that. But Midoriya's leg isn't fine. He doesn't limp, but the difference in the way he moves his left leg compared to the right one is apparent if you're paying enough attention. Which, apparently, no one else does. Whenever Midoriya has to walk up the stairs, he seems to steel himself beforehand. It's a moment in which he takes a small breath and puts a smile on his face. He doesn't stop walking, doesn't slow down, he keeps up the pace and conversation with his friends. But Shoto pays attention. Midoriya has difficulties controlling the way his left foot lands on the stair. It's a few inches off each time compared to the last, even though Midoriya instinctively places his foot in the center of it whenever he isn't injured in some way. His left foot doesn't push off as strongly either. It's weaker than usual. Midoriya uses his right leg to make up for it and doesn't let his weight rest on the left side of his lower body too long. It isn't obvious when you aren't looking down, because Midoriya doesn't react to it much. He talks and moves as quickly as usual despite using a different method to keep up. Shoto'd say it was impressive if it wasn't concerning. It isn't surprising that he's able to act so nonchalantly about pain. Shoto remembers Midoriya's deeply bruised and broken body from the training camp. The way Midoriya just wouldn't stop, even when it was obvious to anyone that he wasn't in any position to fight or even just move. He shouldn't have been running around. Shoto knew that back then. But he didn't do anything. It took losing consciousness for Midoriya to stop. Shoto wonders if the seizures would have been so horrifying if he had been stopped earlier. Still, back then, Midoriya wanted to keep on moving to help others, to save his friend. There was no time to receive medical attention. It was reckless, but it was what many heroes would have done. Now on the other hand, although Midoriya's determination is admirable, it can be misused just like every other trait. Currently Midoriya himself is determined to keep himself hurt and Shoto has trouble understanding why. When Ashido bumps into Midoriya's left side while setting the table, Midoriya jumps away from her and almost drops the precariously balanced plates and cups in his hands. This isn't an unusual reaction to someone touching him unexpectedly, but his strained smile as he waves away her apology and the several moments he waits to keep on moving are telling. He wonders why no one else notices. Shoto comes to a decision. Bakugo. Shoto followed the blonde-haired boy to the stairwell when he saw him leave the common room early the next day. Bakugo stops in his tracks up the stairs. What happened to Midoriya's leg? Bakugo turns around to face him fully. Huh? He crosses his arms. Why would I know what's up with Dash? During the training exercise. Shoto explains. You were the one closest to him. Bakugo doesn't move to descend the stairs, he simply leans back against the wall over the railing. Why the F would I know that? You don't know anything about the leg. Shoto concludes, slightly disappointed. Bakugo was his only potential witness. Bakugo snorts. I have better things to do than babysit Deku. Shoto nods. Thank you for your time. He turns around to return to the common room before the movie ends. It's quite good. He doesn't hear Bakugo move. Just as Shoto's about to open the door, the blonde-haired boy says, if you think he's hiding an injury, you're probably right. He's good at that. Before Shoto can reply, Bakugo's gone, his swift footsteps reverberating through the stairwell. Shoto's left standing there alone as he contemplates the implications of Bakugo's words. This was the first time Shoto heard Bakugo say that Midoriya's good at anything. It must be true then, if even Bakugo acknowledges this ability. His preoccupation with Midoriya's leg is justified, Shoto decides. He keeps replaying Bakugo's words in his mind even while finishing the movie. He shoots glances at Midoriya, who's completely immersed in the happenings of the movie right next to him. He saved Shoto's seat for him as usual. Maybe it's the way Bakugo said the words that made them so memorable. There was no trace of derisiveness, mockery, or even much anger in his voice. He sounded calm. Serious even. Still intense, but in a different way than usual. As Bakugo's words echo in his head, Shoto thinks about reasons why the smiling boy next to him would have had to hide injuries in the past, so often that even Bakugo, who usually only sees what's relevant to himself, noticed. It isn't entirely unexpected. Whenever Midoriya changed in the changing rooms, Shoto couldn't help but wonder how someone with scars so much like his own could say Shoto's past was so much different from his. In the end, Shoto comes to the conclusion that leaving this alone is unacceptable. Regardless of how severe Midoriya's current injury is, this behavior could get him killed. It needs to be addressed, and Shoto will be the one to do so if no one else pays attention. What did you want to talk to me about? Todoroki? Midoriya fidgets, looking around the room nervously. It is unusual enough for Shoto to drag anyone into his own, private space, and locking the room after doing so certainly falls under the abnormal category. But that still doesn't explain the extent of Midoriya's reaction. Midoriya's very and stiff. His eyes track Shoto's every move as if he's afraid to be attacked any second now. Midoriya's scared of being hurt by Shoto. It catches Shoto off guard, so much that he isn't sure how to go about this anymore. Is something wrong? Midoriya asks when Shoto doesn't respond. His voice is more nervous and higher pitched than usual. Midoriya's shaking despite the warmth of the dorm room. Do you have a fever? What? At least now he looks confused instead of sick. When Shoto doesn't respond, he adds, No, Todoroki, I'm not sick. He smiles to reassure him. His smile looks shaky too. Shoto nods. That confirms that Midoriya isn't sick, he's scared. He tells Midoriya to sit down on a futon he prepared for this visit. Midoriya follows his instructions even though his movements are too hesitant and stiff for him to actually want to. But he doesn't say no. His back is too stiff to touch the pillows Shoto placed against the wall to make him more comfortable. His legs aren't comfortably stretched out on the soft piece of fabric. They are almost up to his chest. If his back wasn't so straight, he'd be able to put his arms around them. This must be more painful than standing up. Shoto sits down on the futon he prepared for himself. It's right next to Midoriya's. Is everything okay, Todoroki? He keeps an eye on Shoto's hands, which are placed away from Midoriya on his own lap. Midoriya, Shoto says calmly, turning sideways to look at Midoriya's face, even if the other boy is still looking at his hands. He doesn't move them at all, not sure how Midoriya would react if he did. I can help with your leg if you don't want to go to recovery, girl. Midoriya squeaks, obviously not expecting the conversation to take this turn. He lifts his head to look Shoto in the eyes. His reaction is similar to the last time Shoto addressed the leg problem. His shock is greater than the last time though, probably not expecting Shoto to bring it up days after it happened. I'm not hurt, Todoroki. It's really kind of you to worry, but I know you're injured, Midoriya. Shoto states. I can see it in the way you move your legs and the way you react to being touched around the area. The green-haired boy's eyes widen. If this was anyone else, Todoroki would have gently placed a hand on the injury to demonstrate his observations. But he knew it would do more harm than good in this case. You're hurt and refuse to get help. And you're usually doing that to help someone. Midoriya's shaking his head again. Todoroki, Is it your father? Are you protecting him from getting in trouble? His legs must look especially bad if that's the case. He doesn't hesitate to show his other scars when changing, but the thick material of his boxers always covers up his thighs. He heard some of his classmates theorize that the scars must be caused by his quirk, but Shoto knows what burn scars look like. And Midoriya's quirk only breaks bones, it doesn't burn lasting scars into his skin. What no? After a moment of being lost in his thoughts, his frown morphs into a look of something akin to understanding. He turns to face Shoto fully. He's in the same position he was in before, but it's out of necessity this time. If he stretched his legs any further, his toes would touch Shoto's thighs. His body isn't wound as tightly as before either. Todoroki, my dad isn't hurting me. His voice is soft and the smile accompanying it looks just a bit forced around the edges. My parents divorced when I was little and I haven't seen him ever since. He seems sincere, but Shoto isn't the best at telling if people are lying or not. Are you sure that I haven't seen him? Yeah, I'm sure. Midoriya chuckles lightly. And he never hurt me or my mom. He says, firm and serious. Okay. Shoto says, unwillingly feeling a twinge of disappointment. It's just a bit lonelier knowing that he doesn't share that particular aspect of his past with Midoriya. Where do your scars come from then? Am I what? Midoriya sputters, the look of horror on his face almost matching the one he wore in that moment. He realized Bakugo was gone, having slipped right through his fingers. Like the scars on your shoulders. Shoto explains. It looks like someone burned you there over and over again with their quirk. Oh. For some reason, Midoriya relaxes at that and smiles, even though there's really nothing to be happy about. Those are just from fooling around with friends. He makes a dismissive motion with his right hand. Shoto's eyes widen. It's nothing serious. You know how it is. Midoriya, I don't think you get scars like that from friends. Shoto doesn't know much about friendship, but he's sure of that. It's different. Midoriya shakes his head. It's fine, Todoroki. Really. It's nice of you to worry, but they're really It was Bakugo. Shoto realizes. Midoriya's look of guilt is enough of a confirmation. Bakugo burnt you to he's like my dad. No. Midoriya's eyes are so wide that Shoto can clearly see white around his irises. Kacchan's not like that, Todoroki. He used his quirk on me a bit, but it wasn't his fault. Shoto can't believe what he's hearing. He knew that Midoriya's past was far from painless, but he thought he didn't talk about it because he was hiding it, not because he didn't know it was wrong. It makes him angry and he's not sure at whom. Not his fault. Shoto questions coldly. He lifts up the edge of his shirt, revealing a faint scar on his side. Midoriya follows his gaze and lets out a small gasp. Is this not my dad's fault either? It happened during training, maybe I should have gotten out of the way in time. His voice is more bitter than it's been in months. Do you think it's my fault? No. Of course it's not your fault, Todoroki. Midoriya's response is quick and firm. Even with his limited experience, Shoto is able to determine that he means it. You were a child and your dad shouldn't have treated you like that. It's his fault, not yours. It's the same with you. Shoto says, slowly placing a hand on Midoriya's shoulder on top of the spot he knows one of his scars is beneath his clothing. Midoriya's muscles are tensed, but he doesn't flinch or move away like he would have done at the beginning of the year. It's really not the same. It's complicated. Midoriya smiles weakly. It's fine. It's not. Shoto can't believe he has to say this. It was a long time ago. Middle school was less than a year ago. Shoto could argue about this for a long time, knowing it's important, but despite the valid points he made so far, Midoriya has remained more rigid in his opinion than he's ever been about anything else. Usually, Midoriya tries to understand where the other person's coming from and he succeeds most of the time. But this time, he's immovable. It's best to get back on track for now. Are you hiding scars you got from Bakugo, he spits his name, on your thigh then? Midoriya seems thrown off by the sudden change of topic. No, of course not. Then why won't you let Recovery Girl heal you? Shoto asks, exasperated. Midoriya's past turned out to be different and more horrifying than expected because of the conclusions Midoriya's drawn from it. Despite knowing more about that now, has even less of an idea why it is so hard for Midoriya to get his injury checked out when he doesn't think any of his scars are wrong. It doesn't matter, Todoroki. He sounds just as exhausted as Todoroki feels. It's nothing serious. Shoto counts it as progress that he finally acknowledges he's injured at all. Show it to me then. What? If nothing's wrong, then you have no reason to hide your injury. He draws his legs closer to his chest as if he's scared Shoto will rip his clothes off if he doesn't. Did people do that to him in the past? He closes his eyes, hoping to stave off his unpleasant thoughts for now. He will have time to think about that later. There's a lot to consider. Midoriya's. For now. Are you okay, Todoroki? He hears Midoriya ask. When he opens his eyes, Midoriya's a bit closer to him, looking at his face with worry. You look tired. And it's pretty late already. Midoriya smiles again. He smiles too much. Look, my leg hurts a bit, but it's only bruised. You really shouldn't tire yourself out over this. Then why won't you show it? Shoto asks for what feels like the 1000th time. I'll only stop worrying when I see it. I'm sorry, but I can't show you. Midoriya's voice is shaking. Why not? His resistance is frustrating. I'll leave it alone if you tell me why. Sorry, but dash. You don't need to apologize. He can't help sounding angry. I'll tell Aizawa-sensei if you don't show me. Midoriya's shaking his head frantically. His eyes have tears in them as he pleads, please, Todoroki. Don't do that. Shoto falters in his resolve. I don't want to hurt you, Midoriya. I'm sorry if I did. Midoriya shakes his head. Why you didn't? He hiccups, full on crying now. He buries his face in his arms on his knees. But if I can help you, I might consider doing something you don't want me to do. Midoriya shakes his head and hugs his knees tighter. The white-knuckled grip he has on his right arm must be painful. That's what friends are for, I think. Shoto's not sure what to do to make Midoriya feel better, but he's pretty certain the green-haired boy wouldn't appreciate comforting physical contact, especially if he can't see it. Do you want a tissue? All he can think of doing is trying to make him a bit more comfortable. Midoriya takes the tissue box Shoto got from his desk and stammers out a thank you. Eventually, when Shoto can't hear Midoriya's sobs anymore aside from the occasional sniffle, Midoriya says something. It's so muffled by his clothes that Shoto can't understand. Did you say something? Shoto prompts, trying to sound gentle. Midoriya lifts his head. His eyes are red-rimmed and his face is wet from tears. Midoriya isn't looking at him, but rather at the wall behind Shoto. If I don't show you, you'll tell Aizawa-sensei? Midoriya sounds and looks devastated. It's the way he looked when the class went to visit him at the hospital after Bakugo, his abuser, his mind supplies, had been kidnapped. Yes. He has to. He nods as if he was expecting Shoto to destroy his last hope. If I show you, you won't tell anyone? After a moment of thinking, Shoto says, no. His injury probably isn't something they can't take care of. Recovery Girl would be able to heal it in a second, and that's why he just wants to understand why his friend won't go to her. He wants to make sure Bakugo or someone else didn't burn horrible scars onto his thighs. You won't tell anyone about anything you find there? That means there is something else. No. No matter what it is? Shoto hesitates for a moment until coming to the conclusion that since it's not life-threatening, there's no immediate need to tell someone else. He will have time to convince Midoriya that telling someone is for the best. No matter what it is. Okay. Midoriya breathes. It's not what it looks like, he says, while pulling his sweatpants down to right below his knees. Shoto keeps his distance, not wanting to invade his privacy more than he already is. Midoriya doesn't move to reveal his injury, his hands hovering right over his left knee. I won't tell anyone. Shoto reminds him. Midoriya's hands are shaking as he rolls up the left leg of his boxer. Shoto has to lean a bit closer to get a clear view of it. I bandaged it. Midoriya explains unnecessarily. His boxer is rolled up more than half his thigh now and his upper leg seems to be covered entirely in white gauze. Either Midoriya did a really thorough job with the bandaging or the injury is more severe than he expected. He hopes it's the former. We can change them. Shoto offers and gets the first aid kit he prepared. When he returns, Midoriya's hands are gripping his knees tight enough to leave indents with his nails. He has a faraway look on his face as he stares at the bandages on his leg. Shoto kneels down next to the other teenager and opens the kit. He takes out the scissors and shows them to Midoriya. Can I? He gestures at the leg. Midoriya nods slowly. His eyes refocus and they're full of dread. Shoto's beginning to feel a sense of foreboding himself. He places his left hand on top of Midoriya's to steady his shaking leg. Then he begins cutting the bandages. The skin he can see through the opening he creates is a dark purple that makes him wonder if promising not to tell anyone was the right decision. He stops in his tracks when the bandage falls away far enough to reveal a scar that's straight and horizontal on top of the bruise. Its light pink color stands out against the dark skin surrounding it. As he continues, he realizes that it isn't the only scar like that. After rolling up his boxer leg a bit more and cutting the bandages all the way, he can see that Midoriya's thigh is a collection of lines of different sizes and colors on top of a dark-colored background. Sometimes they overlap, but most of them are straight and horizontal. It'd take long to find them all and count them. The lines are cuts, Shoto's mind supplies as his eyes set on a few barely healed ones in the middle of the bruise. They must have been done right before the injury. Someone deliberately, repeatedly cut Midoriya's thigh to pieces over what must have been a long period of time. Who? His question dies in his throat as his eyes set on the look of shame on Midoriya's face. The green-haired boy looks away, even though he has been watching Shoto until now. He looks back down at the scars. Not someone this was. You. Shoto says quietly. You did this. The look on Midoriya's face is answer enough. I'm sorry. Not sure what to do, Shoto continues with what he planned. He can't seem to properly tear open the plastic the fresh roll of bandages is wrapped in. It seems to slip out of his fingers. He's not even sure if the bandages will help the bruise, they were probably there for the other injures. He feels Midoriya touch his hand lightly, probably trying to get his attention. He's smiling again. Why is he smiling in a situation like this? I can do this, Midoriya says, gently taking the packed bandages out of Shoto's hands. As he stares at his newly empty hands, he realizes that they're shaking just as badly as Midoriya's are. But Midoriya knows how to work around that. Shoto can only watch, dumbfounded, and hand over the necessary equipment to finish hiding away his injuries. When he's done, Midoriya rolls down his boxer leg and pulls up his breathes. All of his movements are quick, practiced. They sit in silence for a few moments after that. Shoto can feel Midoriya's gaze on him, but he can't stop himself from staring at the black sweatpants that cover boxers, bandages and a thigh that was purple, red and white what felt like mere seconds ago. Midoriya's thigh that's full of scars Midoriya made. He will never get that image out of his head. Is your other leg the same? Shoto inquires as calmly as possible. Midoriya startles at his voice, but answers nonetheless, yes. Shoto raises his gaze to look at Midoriya's other limb, trying to imagine two matching thighs with too much scars on them to count. But it's not as bad as it looks. Knowing that you did this is worse than it looks. Shoto says, making Midoriya flinch. When was the last time? He takes a deep breath. When was the last time you'd hurt yourself? Midoriya takes a moment to answer, pondering over something. In the end he just sighs and says, "After dinner." Sheet. He clenches his fists, for lack of something better to do. How long has this been going on? A few years. Midoriya rushes his words, as if that would make Shoto forget about them. Listen, Todoroki, I'm really sorry you had to see this. I know how this looks, but it's dash. Midoriya, if you say this is okay, I'll call Aizawa right now. But you promised. That was before I knew how much danger you're in. Danger? Midoriya lets out a startled laugh, as if the entire concept is too ridiculous to consider. I'm not in danger, Todoroki. You're regularly slicing yourself up dash. Slicing? Deep enough to bleed days after. You could kill yourself by. He trails off, suddenly realizing something. He looks Midoriya in the eyes, needing to see his reaction. You don't want to kill yourself, right? And no, of course not, Todoroki. Midoriya says, sounding surprised enough to be sincere. It's not. That has nothing to do with it. Now that he's looking at Midoriya's face, he can't look away. He looks more uncomfortable and humiliated than Shoto has ever seen him before. And the guilt is practically written on his face. Why are you doing this then? Shoto asks. Midoriya looks at his clenched right fist. It makes me easier to handle. I mean, you saw how I couldn't stop crying. And it helps to stop and make me feel better. Shoto doesn't understand how that works or why that helps. But this is not something he can let go. Midoriya, I don't think I can keep this secret. Please, Todoroki. Midoriya says quietly, more desperate than Shoto has ever heard him before. Shoto shakes his head. I'm sorry. Todoroki, you can't. Please, that I'll be expelled. I'm sure they won't expel you because of this. He isn't sure, but him being expelled is better than Midoriya dying because Shoto doesn't do anything. I'll do anything. Please. Just don't tell anyone. He sounds like that's the worst thing that could ever happen to him. And maybe it is. Shoto unwillingly put himself in a position in which he has a lot of power over Midoriya, he realizes. He could force Midoriya to do anything. This feels wrong. Is breaking a promise to a friend justified for the right reasons? If you promise not to hurt yourself anymore, I won't tell anyone. Thank you. Midoriya looks at Shoto as if he hung the moon. But if you do it again, I'll tell Aizawa-sensei. Midoriya's smile falters. He seems to want to say something but decides against it and simply nods. Do you have any severe injuries? He gestures at Midoriya's right leg. No. Shoto will believe that when hell freezes over. Can I see it? He feels guilty making Midoriya do something he obviously doesn't want to do, but he needs to make sure he isn't bleeding to death. It isn't an unfounded fear considering how deep those wounds on his legs must have been to leave scars like that. It's nothing bad, Todoroki. If I have to keep this a secret, I need to know. It feels wrong, holding this over Midoriya's head, but it's the only way. I'm sorry. I understand. He's quicker about removing his clothing and the bandages this time. Shoto exhales when he sees that this leg looks worse than the other. Perhaps it's because it isn't heavily bruised, but the cuts are even more pronounced. They are swollen and bigger than they have any right to be. There seems to be nowhere Midoriya didn't cut himself on his entire upper leg. The fresh wounds close to Midoriya's knee are still bleeding. Not much, but Midoriya has to use a tissue to stop the blood from overflowing. One of them seems to be gaping accusingly at Shoto. He regrets making his second promise to Midoriya. I think you need stitches for that. It'll heal fine without them. Midoriya would know. Many of the scars must have looked the same at one point. How often do you hurt yourself? The words feel wrong, Forn. He would give anything not to have to ask one of his best friends a question like that. A few times a week. But it depends on how I feel. How you feel? Yeah. He doesn't elaborate, clearly uncomfortable with the conversation. Feel like. He gestures at the scars and open wounds on Midoriya's leg. You can come to me. Midoriya's look of surprise morphs into one of fondness. Thank you, Todoroki. This time, Shoto has regained enough of his composure to help Midoriya clean his wounds and wrap his leg. If it's properly bandaged and disinfected, there probably won't be any complications. He will keep a close eye on Midoriya, though. Thank you. Midoriya says when they're done, smiling weakly at Shoto. For everything. I'm really sorry for causing you so much trouble. I don't care about the trouble as long as I can help you. Shoto says truthfully. You're very kind, Todoroki. Midoriya says. I'll try not to disappoint you. Midoriya leaves to go back to his room. Shoto can't fall asleep that night, no matter how hard he tries. Eventually, he decides that his time is best spent not trying to achieve something impossible and gets his laptop. It's time to do some research. He browses the internet for the best ways to help a friend with problems like Midoriya. Eventually, he falls into a fitful sleep plagued with images of damaged ties and bleeding leg wounds. Despite everything else that happened that evening, Shoto doesn't forget about Bakugo. It's hard to forget when he now sees Bakugo in Midoriya's flinches, his fidgeting and his apologies. Whenever Midoriya startles at Bakugo's explosions, he imagines Bakugo letting them off on Midoriya's body instead of the wall as Midoriya smiles at him without trying to move away. Bakugo's insults to Midoriya have gained a new meaning now that he knows Midoriya believes them. With all of these thoughts weighing on his mind, it's not surprising that it all comes to a head during the cleanup after dinner. It has no particular trigger, none that would justify the extent of his reaction. Out of my way, Deku. Bakugo reaches out toward Midoriya's shoulder, probably to physically push him away, but instead ends up touching a wall of ice. Don't touch him, Shoto says. He doesn't care that everyone's staring at him, he only has eyes for Bakugo and his hands that have caused too much damage already. After a moment of staring, dumbfounded, at the ice, Bakugo rounds on Shoto. Huh! He yells, clenching his fists in preparation for a fight as he tramps across the room quickly. What's your problem, Icy Hot? I think it's best if we all calm down. Kirishima says placatingly, stepping closer to them. The hands he puts on their shoulders are shaken off. Bakugo continues glaring at Shoto, ready to. Shoto stares right back, knowing that his lack of a response annoys Bakugo greatly. Bakugo is the first to interrupt their silent stare-off. What did you just say? His teeth are gritted, as if he had any right to be angry after what he did. Midoriya should be the one to rage. I told you, Shoto says slowly, calmly, completely contrasting Bakugo's behavior. Not to touch Midoriya. Is that so hard for you to understand? He enunciates every word carefully, as if Bakugo truly had trouble comprehending what Shot had to say, even though he's pretty sure Bakugo is only unable to read between the lines. Why would you have the right to tell me what to do? Bakugo yells, even more enraged. Even so, he doesn't feel even a semblance of Shoto's fury. Shoto ignores Bakugo, not caring about his demands. You'll keep your distance from Midoriya. You'll never touch Midoriya again. Todoroki Midoriya says from his right side. His voice sounds pretty close, he must have come over to stand next to them. Bakugo cuts himself off, looking too angry to speak. You can't even tell me what to do. You think you're better than me? Shoto's smile in response doesn't show any humor behind it. He moves into a fighting position. He can feel the heat and cold beneath his skin, quirks ready to activate at a moment's notice. I now know I'm better than you, Bakugo. Bakugo raises his arm, no doubt to fire off an explosion. Shoto's prepared, he activates his quirk to create a shield of ice, but it never comes. He blinks at the lack of anything appearing for either of them. That must mean. He turns his head to look around the room. It doesn't take long to find Aizawa staring at the scene with glowing, red eyes. Almost the entire class is here, even though most of them left earlier to get ready for bed after dinner. Shoto notes that Ida is missing still, which is probably why they haven't received a hand-chopping lecture yet. What is going on here? Aizawa asks. He's wearing more comfortable clothes than usual, which means he's probably even more disgruntled than he'd normally be about a fight like this. When neither Shoto nor Bakugo answer, Kirishima speaks up nervously. Todoroki and Bakugo were having a discussion, but everything's cool now. Aizawa clearly doesn't buy the excuse. A discussion about what? Well, Kirishima glances between Bakugo, Shoto and Midoriya, who is standing right next to Shoto. About the math test tomorrow. Midoriya improvises quickly. He lowers his head slightly as Aizawa's sharp gaze focuses on him. Todoroki said he's better than him at math. And Kacchan didn't like it. He shifts at Bakugo's glare. Yeah, that's right. Kirishima grins nervously. Ashido, Aoyama and Kaminari, who were with them on cleaning duty, nod along. Aizawa's gaze travels over the rest of their classmates in the room. Some of them avoid his piercing eyes, but no one denies Midoriya's story. Fine. Aizawa sighs. He turns back to Bakugo and Todoroki. You're both on cleaning duty for the next 4 days. He drawls. If you ever have a discussion again, the punishments won't be this mild. With those words, he walks from the room. We should finish cleaning up. Midoriya says, shooting a nervous look at Shoto. Yes. Shoto agrees. It doesn't take long to finish up, especially now that some other people joined in to help. At least part of their plan must have been to function as human buffers between Shoto and Bakugo, seeing as they are always at least 2 feet apart. Todoroki, Midoriya says once they're done. Can I talk to you for a second? Shoto nods and follows Midoriya to a deserted corner of the room. Are you okay? Am I? I mean. He lowers his voice. You seemed pretty worked up there. Midoriya's worried about him. I'm fine. Shoto says. Despite still having his concerned frown on his face, Midoriya nods. That's good. He bites his lip, unsure about something. Shoto has to lean closer to hear what he says next. I unloaded a lot on you yesterday. He looks guilty about that, even though Shoto prefers that to not knowing. You offered that I can come talk to you whenever. You know. He looks around the room nervously. So I just want you to know that it's the same for you. He starts waving his hands. Not that you need it for. But if you need to talk about anything or have anything you need help with, I can be there for you too. After a moment of silence, he adds, only if you want to, of course. Thank you, Midoriya. Shoto says, not sure how to react. Midoriya's concern caught him off guard, especially since he expected anger, but he's glad to have a friend like him. You shouldn't be angry at Kacchan. Midoriya says softly. You don't know the whole story. Abruptly, his anger returns. That doesn't matter. Not sure how he'll react to more of Midoriya trying to excuse his abuser's behavior, Shoto says, it's late. I'll go to bed. Todoroki dash. Good night, Midoriya. He hurries away without looking back, wanting to get to his room as quickly as possible. Coming face to face with Bakugo, possibly the last person he wants to see right now, or ever again, leaning against the wall next to Shoto's door with his arms crossed is not part of the plan. What do you want? Shoto grits out. Let's settle this. Bakugo says. Once and for all. What do you mean? Perhaps lack of sleep is making him slower than usual. Let's fight. Let's decide who's better. It's just like Bakugo to focus on that. Yesterday, he would have said his determination to always win was one of Bakugo's good qualities. Today, it reminds him of ugly scar tissue. That's not what I meant. What the F, did you mean then, icy hot? Bakugo lets one of his explosions go off. Only to create a loud, threatening sound, not to harm anyone. It still makes Shoto snap. He's close enough to grip Bakugo's shoulder right where the worst burn scars are on Midoriya's body. Bakugo violently slaps his hand away. Take one look at Midoriya. He hopes his low, angry voice is able to mirror the fury that he feels at this boy. Yesterday, he would have called Bakugo a friend, but he won't ever be able to think about him that way. He's an abuser. An endeavor. Or better yet, take a look at his thighs. With that he tears open his bedroom door, slams it shut and locks it before Bakugo can follow. He lets his body sink to the floor, leaning his head against the wall. After taking a few deep breaths, his own words begin to sink in. He shouldn't have said that. He lets his face fall onto his palms, elbows on his knees. His drawn knees remind him of Midoriya's position, which he maintained during almost their entire conversation yesterday. Bakugo is the last person he should have said that to. Shoto just. He sighs, burying his face deeper in his hands. He just wanted Bakugo to think about how his own actions affected Midoriya. He rubs at his tired eyes. He should go to sleep. Shoto gets up to find his nightclothes. Bakugo probably didn't really pay attention to what Shoto had to say anyway. He's too exhausted to shower, so he just changes quickly. And even if Bakugo did pay attention, he wouldn't care enough to force Midoriya to do anything, right? Shoto hopes not. He'll have to try to make this right tomorrow. His sleep isn't much better than the night before. He has a nightmare in which Midoriya slices both his wrists with the sharp razor blades he read about, right in front of him. Shoto can't touch him and Midoriya can't hear him. He can't do anything. He's helpless. Then Bakugo comes and helps Midoriya finish the job with one hand on the blade, the other burning a hole in his shoulder. Midoriya tries to shake his hand off, but he can't. He stops trying. He and Bakugo grip the same razor blade, hands on top of each other's, and lift it high up in the air, clearly about to slice a wound with great momentum. Shoto calls out even though no one can hear him. No! He wakes up with a gasp, covered in sweat. He tells Midoriya that he wants to check his entire body for injuries that evening. Everywhere? Midoriya asks nervously. They're in Shoto's room again. During his hours of research he read somewhere that putting too much pressure on people who self-harm isn't the way to go about it. That even telling them to stop altogether isn't going to help. But the people who wrote those articles had never seen Midoriya's thighs. He'd rather have Midoriya feel like he's being monitored than have him die. Shoto nods. You don't have to take off your underwear, just like when you're changing for training. This feels wrong. This probably is wrong. He's abusing his power. All right. Midoriya has a strained smile on his face. If that makes you feel better. He's abusing Midoriya's feelings of guilt. He's a horrible person. There are no cuts anywhere but on his thighs. And he hasn't injured himself since their conversation 2 days ago. Shoto exhales in relief. Shoto keeps his distance from Bakugo and Bakugo miraculously doesn't bother him or Midoriya after Shoto's slip-up. Shoto doesn't care what motivates his strange behavior as long as it keeps staying this way. He checks Midoriya for scars every second day for a few weeks. When none turn up, he switches to doing it only once a week, granting Midoriya a bit more privacy. He doesn't stop doing it even on days Midoriya has to change in the changing rooms. He might be paranoid, but he needs to see it up close. His bruise takes long to heal, but it fades eventually and Midoriya starts walking normally again. Midoriya doesn't come talk to him once about wanting to hurt himself. He hopes that means that he found another, healthy coping mechanism instead of cutting. Aside from the occasional checkup in Shoto's room, their friendship is back to the way it's always been, mainly because both of them pretend those nights in Shoto's room never happened. Shoto doesn't forget about Bakugo or Midoriya's thighs, but he tries not to show this, aside from the occasional attempt to convince Midoriya to tell someone about either of those issues. All in all, things have been going well, a lot better than Shoto expected. That is, of course, when something goes wrong. Midoriya has been pale the entire day and he still is when he enters Shoto's room for his checkup. His movements are shaky as he gets undressed. There are no new cuts, which must mean that Midoriya's feeling bad for another reason. Are you sick? Midoriya shakes his head. I'm fine. Shoto doesn't press the matter. The next day, when Kirishima bumps into Midoriya on the couch during movie night and Midoriya's face twists into a painful grimace, Shoto thinks he must have missed something. He asks Midoriya for another checkup, not feeling any less uncomfortable about being able to order him around so easily. He doesn't find anything again. He almost exhales in relief until he thinks back to where exactly Kirishima got in contact with Midoriya. It can't. Midoriya, he feels awkward asking this question. Can you show me your hips? What do you mean? Midoriya laughs nervously. You can see them already. His panic begins to rise at Midoriya's look of guilt. Can you pull down the edge of your boxers a bit? Midoriya's silent. Shoto closes his eyes for a moment. Please, Midoriya. Midoriya complies and pulls his breathes down a bit on his right side, far away from the spot Kirishima accidentally hit him on. Shoto wants to cry out in frustration when he sees all too familiar scars on Midoriya's skin. They are healed, which means this isn't a one-time thing. Can you show me your other side? Shoto asks, voice pleading. He's desperate for it not to be like he fears. Midoriya's reluctance probably means that it is. He complies at Shoto's tone of voice. Midoriya pulls it down enough to reveal a big band-aid almost soaked through with blood. The blood didn't show through the boxers because they're black. Now that the skin around his hips and his lower stomach is visible, Shoto realizes that things haven't been going as great as he wanted to believe. They have been getting worse, arguably. Midoriya must have been cutting regularly for there to be so many scars. Shoto grips his own knees tightly. How could Shoto have been so stupid? Can you please take it off? His voice is hoarse, shaky. He hasn't sounded like this since he was a child. I'm sorry, Todoroki. Midoriya says, voice thick with tears. He removes the band-aid quickly, letting out a hiss of pain. Sheet. This. Shoto gapes at the wide, long gash that stretches from the Midoriya's side to his lower abdomen. Tearing off the bandage must have reopened it again, if the blood starting to continuously flow down Midoriya's skin is anything to go by. He quickly gets one of his shirts to press against the wound. I can do this, Midoriya says, placing his own fingers on the piece of clothing. They're shaking. He's not sure if it's because of blood loss or emotions. No. Shoto shakes his head. You can't. In the end, he lets Midoriya put most of the pressure on the wound while he takes his phone out of his pocket. His hands are bloody. He unlocks it after a few tries of trying to type his password properly. What are you doing? Midoriya asks, voice full of dread. I need to call Aizawa-sensei. Todoroki. Please. Midoriya sounds smaller and more ashamed than he's ever heard him before, which is no small feat. Midoriya's sitting, almost lying, on his futon, legs outstretched, head and shoulders leaned against the wall. He doesn't seem to have any energy left to sit in his usual position. His boxers that look more like shorts are pulled low, which means they cover all of the scars on his thighs. That doesn't help much, considering the way his stomach looks. Midoriya's eyes are glazed over and bloodshot. He's not pressing down hard enough. He looks like a scene out of Shoto's worst nightmares. But in reality, Shoto isn't helpless. Even if I didn't think Aizawa-sensei needs to know about your self-mutilation, he gestures at Midoriya's body, encompassing all the areas he used as places to harm himself. I don't think you can survive this injury alone without help. And even if you did somehow, I don't think you can survive this habit without help. Even with this wound, Midoriya would have died rather than ask for help. If Shoto hadn't noticed. I'm fine, Todoroki. Midoriya shakes his head, getting to his feet too quickly. Please just. He reaches for Shoto's phone, but misses completely. Shoto has to grip his arm to steady him. Don't. He blinks several times, looking around the room, eyes unseeing. Midoriya. Shoto calls out as Midoriya's knees start to buckle. He grips his other arm, slowly lowering him to the ground. He checks for a pulse and lays him down in a stretched-out position on his back, hoping that it's best for the wound. He dials Aizawa's number with shaky, bloody fingers. Everything will be okay. He whispers, not sure why he's saying it out loud. Aizawa picks up. He's injured. A soft voice says. Shoto presses his phone closer to his ear, setting down the pen he used for grading. Papers that showed a significant lack of understanding when it came to any legal procedures pertaining to the heroics industry. He'd like to say he was surprised, but Shoto knows his class. Just like he knows this voice, and its tone rings alarm bells coming from him. He gets to his feet. You need to come. Todoroki? He asks as he hastily leaves the comfortable, empty room he likes to use for correcting anything he knows is going to give him headaches. There's no response. He can only hear the boy's rapid breaths. Where are you? Todoroki doesn't answer for a while. Shoto's outside of the building in no time, feeling the cool winter air on his skin. It fills his lungs quicker as the rapidity of his steps increases. His favorite grading place isn't too far away from Class 1 as dorms. It can't be with how much trouble his students seem to be getting into, but now, hurrying down the well-cared-for path between the buildings, Shoto wishes he had been closer. In the common room preferably. Assuming that Todoroki is even in the dorms. Luckily, those concerns are placated when Todoroki's voice finally breaks the silence of the night around him. My room. That narrows down the number of possible candidates for injury. Todoroki is smart enough not to drag injured students to his own room, which means that they had to be there at the time of injury or enter the room with injuries Todoroki didn't know about. Shota doesn't think Todoroki'd use his room as a training ground, not even Bakugo's done that. As for the second option, there's one student whose pattern of behavior goes together with it too well. It's bad, you need to hurry. According to past statistics, it's rational to assume it's Midoriya, one of Todoroki's closest friends, the only person Shota knows of that Todoroki regularly invites to his room. He quickens his steps. I'm almost there. Shota opens the door to his class's dorm building, relieved to see that most of his students seem to have gone to bed already. The cleaning duty system still appears to be working well if the lack of any uncleaned dishes, food scraps, or scattered belongings are any indication. Are you in danger? He asks quietly enough that the few students around can't hear. No, he releases a small sigh of relief. Sensei? Yaoyorozu asks, clearly noticing his unusually frantic movements. The only students around are Yaoyorozu and Jiro, already in their night clothes, preparing cups of tea for themselves. You should go to bed. When the vice class president opens her mouth to speak again, he adds, I'll tell you more tomorrow. You're not in danger. Their nods indicate that this is enough to pacify them for now, so he continues his quick steps. It wouldn't do to attract a crowd of frantic kids trying to help. It wouldn't make dealing with the situation any easier, especially since none of them have a healing quirk. And a healing quirk is what they'll need if Midoriya's injured enough to make Todoroki sound like that. Todoroki? The line has gone eerily silent, as if Todoroki's previously frantic, quick breaths were enough to make up for not breathing at all now. Todoroki? He repeats, hauling himself up another flight of stairs with his capture weapon. It's quiet on the line aside from some movement in the distance. Shota's almost there. He doesn't run into anyone else. It's late enough for most of them to be in their own rooms on weekdays at this hour. It was just past 11 p.m. when he last checked the time in his room. He runs down the hall, grabs the door handle and opens it, or would open it if the door wasn't locked. Todoroki? He asks, loud enough to be heard on the other side of the door, but not loud enough to alert anyone in the other rooms. He hopes the call didn't go silent because his theory's wrong and Todoroki's somehow injured too. He didn't sound injured. There's a click, hopefully indicating that the door is unlocked. Shota opens the door, momentarily stopping in his tracks at the sight. There's a body on the floor in the center of Todoroki's spacious room. The vastness of the room further accentuates the body's small size. As Aizawa approaches, he realizes that it's indeed Midoriya. Todoroki is first to arrive next to the futon the green-haired boy is lying on, kneeling to check his neck for a pulse. As his arm extends, Shota realizes how unsteady it is. Todoroki's face is pale, his hands and clothes bloody. His gaze is distant and glassy. Aizawa crouches down on Midoriya's other side, next to where a cloth of some sort covers Midoriya's side. It's so red that there's no way of determining its original color. He quickly sends out an emergency message to Recovery Girl and puts his phone away. There's no pulse. Todoroki whispers, hoarse and shaken. Shota startles and looks up at him, only to meet pleading heterochrome eyes. You have to help him. Please. Shota extends his hand to check for a heartbeat himself, because if there isn't one then, well, there isn't much they can do if Midoriya's already dead. He can't let this be the first time one of the students under his care dies. He's desperate not to lose his student today, another boy whose very nature motivates others, another boy who doesn't value his own life nearly enough. He shakes those thoughts away as he places his hand between the bone and the tendon over Midoriya's radial artery. It's weak. It takes a while for him to even realize it's there. But there's a heartbeat. Todoroki's staring down at Midoriya's blue lips and pale face when Shota places a hand on his shoulder. The boy stiffens but looks up again. He has won, is all Shota says before quickly moving to position himself so that he has access to the cloth that covers the source of the bleeding. It becomes clear how severe it is when he feels something wet on his knees. He looks down and sees a pool of blood next to Midoriya's side. Carefully, he removes the piece of clothing, a shirt that's unusable now, and sees the gash on Midoriya's side. He uses some of the gauze from the first aid kit to wipe away as much of the blood as he can. He needs to see it to be able to perform a preliminary examination. The wound is not as bad as he expected after feeling Midoriya's slow heartbeat and seeing the amount of blood the boy lost. No vital organs appear to have been injured. His gaze travels along Midoriya's body, checking for further injuries. It doesn't take long to find several more cuts none too far away from the deep gash. Are there any other injuries that require immediate medical attention? And no, Todoroki answers. None that are that severe. Shota nods and places the shirt in its previous position. He uses his capture scarf to secure it tightly and lift Midoriya up in his arms as gently as possible. We're going to Recovery Girl's office. He throws over his shoulder, already striding towards the door. There's some questions I need to ask you. This draws Todoroki out of his daze. Quick footsteps follow behind him on their way to the infirmary. They don't have to wait long for an elevator, luckily, because taking the stairs isn't an option with Midoriya's injuries. He regularly checks for a pulse and makes sure not to move the kid around too much. All the while, Midoriya doesn't even stir. With this type of injury, it takes long for it to get this bad. To lose enough blood to be entirely unresponsive from a wound like this means a lack of proper treatment for a long time. He wants to grimace at the realization that Midoriya didn't ask for it. It takes a while to arrive in Recovery Girl's office. They have no clear procedure on how to deal with injuries that were sustained in the dorms, although Shota can't be sure if that's even the case here. Getting hurt in training, in the fields outside or the designated training areas is something they planned on. There are materials and personnel ready to take care of any injuries during training. There aren't any now. Lay him down on the bed. Recovery Girl says absently, dragging a pre-prepared table with medical supplies next to it. Shota instructed Todoroki to text her the details of the injury on their way here. He's glad about the decision now. He places Midoriya on the bed as gently as possible, removing his capture scarf and the shirt. This'll need stitches, she says, getting to work. She hooks him up to a machine to measure his heartbeat, and to provide him with necessary fluids and starts looking for the right supplies. When she glances up to see them standing there, she says, "There's nothing you can do here. You can get cleaned up in my office. I'll get you when I'm done." Shota needs to nudge Todoroki's shoulder to get him moving when he sees that he doesn't stop staring, transfixed at Recovery Girl's movements. She was right to tell them to leave. He sits the boy down in one of the few chairs in Recovery Girl's office. Todoroki complies, not reacting in any other way. He wets some towels and crouches to clean the hands Todoroki's been staring at. Recovery Girl herself uses her office to get cleaned up after surgeries. Once he's done with cleaning the boy's arms, he scrubs at his own hands and the towels in the sink, watching as blood, Midoriya's blood, goes down the drain. Even once he's back in the chair next to Todoroki, the boy's absent expression hasn't changed. He releases a long-suffering sigh to draw the boy's attention. Todoroki turns his head to look at him. Despite the state he's in, Shota can't delay the question much longer. What happened? Whatever happened must have been bad enough to leave one of the most stoic members of his class scattered and visibly shaken. Todoroki's silent for a few moments. When he speaks, his quiet, slightly trembling voice further emphasizes the severity of the situation. "Asked me not to tell anyone." "Midoriya?" Todoroki nods. "It's too late for that now. It's been for quite some time. We're going to find the perpetrator and punish them adequately." Todoroki bites his lip, but doesn't respond. "Don't you want to help Midoriya?" "I do." Todoroki answers without hesitation. "You could help him." Todoroki clenches his fists. "I don't think you want to protect someone who did this to your friend. Why would Midoriya hide an injury if it wasn't to protect the one who hurt him? He's never tried to hide life-threatening injuries before when there were means and time available to help him." Todoroki swallows, face still pale in the dim light of the office. "I don't." "Who was it then?" Aizawa prompts. years of teaching experience rendering him capable of determining that there's nothing more needed to finally get an answer. It was Midoriya. Shota waits for Todoroki to go on, to finish a sentence that seems to lack another name, but he doesn't. It takes a moment for it to sink in, for Shida to realize that Todoroki isn't simply repeating the name of the victim but simultaneously saying the name of the perpetrator. His blood runs cold. Midoriya cut himself. Todoroki nods. Was it an accident? He asks, almost hopefully, despite knowing that such a deep, clean cut couldn't have been accidental. Todoroki's pinched expression of guilt is another indicator of the answer that follows. No. Shota feels the need to rephrase the question to make sure he isn't jumping to conclusions. Midoriya cut himself deliberately? Yes. With a knife. I don't know, Todoroki falters, looking down at his lap. I never asked. Never? Does that mean? The realization hits him in the gut worse than even All Might's punches at full power could. Shota takes a deep breath. Is this the first time Midoriya cut himself deliberately? In the seconds Todoroki takes to answer, Shota hopes that his suspicions aren't correct. He hopes that his student hasn't been causing himself harm right under his nose, under his care. He hopes Midoriya is only reckless and self-destructive, instead of suicidal and self-mutilating on top of that. No, it's been going on for years. Todoroki chokes out as if it's the most difficult thing he's ever said. I found out a few weeks ago. He lifts his head to look Shota in the eyes. His gaze is begging for forgiveness as he goes on. I told him I'd tell you if he cut himself again. I didn't. The boy's voice breaks. There are a few uncharacteristic tears in his eyes. I didn't know he was still doing it. I didn't check there. I'm so stupid. He sounds almost hysterical now. This must have been boiling under the surface for a while now. I wanted to believe that he just stopped, that he's better and knows that I'm there to help, but he releases a breath that's somewhere between a cough and a sob. He kept doing it and then, he almost dies and he doesn't care enough to tell anyone. He sounds frustrated and devastated at the same time. He wipes at his eyes furiously. This was the least and most inevitable kind of threat. In order to counteract it easily, they only had to know first. But Midoriya, the most affected person, didn't want them to know, and that made it extremely hard to do anything about it. This is my fault. Todoroki says quietly, more to himself than Shota. I knew and I didn't do anything to help. As his teacher, Shota should have seen Midoriya's struggles, especially considering how long this has been going on. But Todoroki, this wasn't his responsibility. You could have told us earlier, yes. But, he says sternly, putting emphasis on his last word. This isn't on you. I could have You tried to help your friend any way you thought you could. There's nothing wrong with that. Next time, though, Todoroki didn't do anything wrong, but he needs to know this for the future. You should tell a teacher right away. When someone's a danger to themselves, it's hard to believe his cheerful, determined student is the one this description applies to. They usually aren't in the right mindset to decide whether they need help or not. As your teachers, we're here to advise you on how to help a friend in such a situation. I'll try to do better in the future. Hopefully there won't be any future instances in which his advice would come to fruition. Thank you for being there, Sensei. Despite the situation, Shota's lips move into a small smile. That's what teachers are here for. Remember that. It doesn't take long for Recovery Girl to be done with her treatment. Injuries such as this one are a regular occurrence. Battle training is essential for being a capable hero after all. There are several students enrolled at UA with quirks that can break skin and cause significant blood loss. They don't usually wait long enough to lose this much blood, though. Shota sends Todoroki back to the dorms to get some rest. He tells him to take some time off tomorrow if needed. Todoroki's reluctance to leave is written all over his rigid, inflexible stance next to Midoriya's bed. Shota sighs, there's nothing you can do here. You can come back to visit him tomorrow after school. Midoriya will still be here. There's a lot to discuss. Todoroki hesitates. His brows furrow and he takes a deep breath. I don't want to leave him alone. Shota opens his mouth to repeat his earlier proposition about visitation rights, but lets it fall close when he realizes what the distress written on Todoroki's face means. You think Midoriya will try to harm himself here? If that's truly a concern, the situation is worse than he expected. I'm not. Todoroki gives Midoriya's still form on the bed a once-over, as if that could help him answer the question. He didn't want you to know. He begged me not to tell anyone. He shakes his head quickly in a way that has nothing to do with denying a statement, but everything to do with staving off unpleasant memories. I think me telling you is the worst thing that could happen for him. I think he shouldn't be alone. Shota absorbs his words and nods slowly. Someone will be with him at all times. Despite his lingering reluctance, Todoroki leaves. The moment he's out the door, Shota lets himself sag into the chair at Midoriya's bedside. He closes his eyes for a moment to escape his pale, sleeping student, whose state is a symbol for Shota's mistakes. Midoriya could have died. Shota knew Midoriya would survive the moment they handed him over to Recovery Girl with a heart that was still beating. UA has Recovery Girl and enough supplies, such as blood transfusions, to make that possible. There was no reason to fear for Midoriya's life to begin with. Or there shouldn't have been. But Midoriya could have died. If he hadn't been with Todoroki, he would have bled to death in his UA dorm room slowly overnight, with his friends, classmates and teachers none the wiser. He would have died a preventable death alone and in pain because he didn't trust his teachers enough to help him. Did he almost lose one of his students because he was too strict? He had told Midoriya he'd be a liability on the field if he got injured. Did that contribute to their present situation? Regardless of how much he was complicit in Midoriya's behavior, Shota should have noticed it before. The wound is self-inflicted. Recovery Girl's voice interrupts his straying thoughts. She must have finished cleaning herself up after the procedure. Shota opens his eyes. Shizenji's standing on the other side of Midoriya's bed, her face barely looking over it at the boy. She's wearing a pained expression on her face. I know. It isn't the only one. I know. Todoroki told me. Shizenji doesn't stop looking at Midoriya. He injured his lower abdomen repeatedly. There are many important blood vessels there which dash. I know, Shizenji. He isn't surprised at the exhaustion in his own voice. It's been going on for weeks. She says. At least every second day. Wait. Weeks. Shizenji nods. I couldn't heal most of them, since they have scarred too much already. They were clearly inflicted with the same tool, probably a thin blade. Did he have any other injuries? Shizenji frowns. No, not that I'm aware of. Todoroki said it's been going on for years. Shizenji lowers her head even more. There aren't necessarily scars from this kind of behavior. Her tone of voice sounds even more pained than her expression. Smaller cuts can heal completely. Maybe. Shota doubts Midoriya would have told Todoroki how long it's been going on without any evidence necessitating him to be truthful. I'll talk to him. Poor child. Shizenji mumbles, sitting down in her rolling chair not too far away. The pressure must have gotten too much. How long will he have to stay here? Shota asks, knowing that Midoriya will probably not be going back to the dorms anytime soon. He should be fine to leave by noon. Using my quirk with severe blood loss is tricky. He will need a lot of rest and fluids. She explains while typing something, likely a report of Midoriya's injuries, on the computer. I had to stitch the deepest wound for now, but I will be able to heal it in a few days when he's regained some strength. He will stay longer. I understand. Todoroki thinks he needs to be kept under surveillance. Shizenji's fingers still momentarily, before continuing their quick movements. It's for the best. That child is clearly a danger to himself. Will he wake up any time soon? No. Not until morning at least. Shota nods. After that we need to schedule people watching him until we can accurately predict his behavior. It might be embarrassing for Midoriya, but it's better than risking a student's suicide. Despite Todoroki's words in Shizenji's office, there's a chance that Midoriya isn't only neglecting his own well-being but also actively seeking death. Even Todoroki had his doubts when he refused to leave. They will find out later. For now, Shota will get some rest. He'll need to be in good shape tomorrow. He removes one of his sleeping bags from its rightful place in the drawer in the corner of the room. Shizenji doesn't even protest. She gave up on trying to get him to sleep properly a long time ago. He informs the necessary teachers and the principal. Nedzu, Hizashi, and Namuri are the only ones he tells the specifics for now. Between the four of them and Shizenji, monitoring Midoriya should be easy enough. Sleep doesn't come easily. It's not surprising, of course, with everything that happened. When he determines that there's no chance of him being able to go back to sleep, he isn't shocked to see that it's just after 6 a.m. on his phone display. He spends an hour answering his fellow teachers' questions. All of them range somewhere between professional to frantic with worry. He sighs when he reads Yagi's painful attempts at coming off as a concerned teacher instead of the panicked parental figure he clearly is to Midoriya. He isn't successful. Shota didn't tell him how Midoriya had gotten his injury because he didn't want to deal with his reaction. Yagi's too personally involved to handle this properly, but he deserves to know. Just like Midoriya's mom will have to be told eventually. That will have to wait until they hear what happened from Midoriya's perspective. Until then, Yagi's concern will have to be waved away. The principal asks him to meet him in his office. Luckily, Shizenji has no other patience and enough time to stay with Midoriya. When he arrives, Hizashi and Namuri are sitting next to each other on a couch that's supposed to be comfortable. Both of them are stiff though, their postures tense and uncharacteristically somber expressions on their faces. Shota, Hizashi says when he looks up from the clenched fists he's been staring at in his lap. His eyes are red-rimmed with distress and lack of sleep. How's the little listener? Shota closes the door behind himself and sits down in the couch across from them. They're both looking at him expectantly. He sighs. His condition hasn't changed since I texted you 20 minutes ago. He's still sleeping then? Namuri asks. Shota told them everything he knows already. What good is digital communication if people want to hear everything in person anyway? He should be sleeping for a while. He decides to continue before they can waste any more time with their questions. He's fine. He'll have scars, but there's no permanent damage. Both of their postures relax visibly. Namuri isn't gripping her elbow quite as tightly as before, where her arms are crossed, and Hizashi leans back a bit from his previously stiffly hunched over position. Even if it's illogical, they needed to hear this. We'll have to figure out how he's doing mentally when he wakes up. They both nod. Shota looks around the room, trying to figure out where Nedzu is. Hiding, but from what he can tell the rat isn't around. He's probably watching from somewhere, waiting for the right moment to... The door in the back of the room opens. Make a dramatic entrance. Shota wants to go back to sleep. Hello, Nedzu says pleasantly as he approaches them, making both Hizashi and Namuri jump since both of them have been too lost in thought to hear Nedzu's quiet movements. We have a lot to discuss. He sits down in his favorite armchair, setting the files and folders he brought down on the coffee table between them. He must have gotten Shizenji's report. He doesn't prepare or offer tea, but gets straight to the point. As I read in your report, Midoriya was in critical condition when you found him in Todoroki's room yesterday, correct? Yes. Due to blood loss from self-inflicted injuries, correct? Yes. Hizashi winces. Both Todoroki and Shizenji confirmed this, correct? Yes. He can do nothing but affirm the principal's questions. They are all about things he already told him, but in this case it's necessary to ask them for Nedzu's own report. Even though the order of the questions seems a bit all over the place, Shota knows the principal probably has his own ingenious system. He learned not to question him. Thank you, Shota. He says in the same pleasant, almost chipper tone of voice he used the duration of the entire questioning. He leans back in his chair, making himself even more comfortable. After a few moments of silence, Nedzu speaks up again. Regardless of what we find out from questioning him, sending Midoriya to a mental health facility isn't an option with the current atmosphere. What do you mean? Hizashi explodes, throwing his hands up in the air. If that's what the kid needs, the school's reputation shouldn't matter. Hizashi has always had a tendency to jump to conclusions when experiencing strong emotions about something. I never said it was solely about our school's reputation. The solely makes Hizashi grit his teeth audibly. I am concerned about Midoriya just as much as the rest of you, but I can't condone sending him away from the school to be vulnerable to villain attacks. No matter how secure a facility is, there's always a way in. And protecting my student will be all the harder if I'm not familiar with it. Hisashi deflates noticeably. It's a logical explanation. The reason for implementing the dorm system was to be able to protect the students from any further harm. There are strict regulations and rules to keep the kids safe. Not even visits to family are allowed unless it's an emergency. It's only natural that Midoriya won't be sent to an outside facility for help even if it has the most suitable treatment options. It's regretful, but this doesn't mean we have no way of helping him. We have plenty of mental health professionals available that I trust who can help him on site. First, though, he grabs the gray folder from the coffee table and hands it over to Shota. He takes it from him without question and frowns at the stack of papers inside of it. I need you to do a psychological evaluation, Shota. Me? Shota asks incredulously, glancing back down at the list of questions again. I'm hardly qualified for it. The only thing you need to do is ask the questions I prepared for you. Shota thinks it's unnecessary to point out that Nezu isn't qualified for that either, especially considering that he probably is. The rat most likely has some sort of degree that makes him more than qualified for it. There's nothing academic Nezu wouldn't be able to achieve, Shota is sure. Tsukachi will be accompanying you, just to be sure we find out the truth. The detective? Nemuri asks, brows furrowed. She hasn't come in contact with him and his quirk much yet. Yup. The principal chirps. It's arranged already. He's free at 4 p.m. today. Shota grips the folder and papers in his hands tightly. You think sicking a lie detector on him will make him more comfortable? Or strengthen the trust in me, his teacher, he already doesn't seem to have. Oh, he trusts you more than most, Shota. Nezu says, casually dismissive. The principal's behavior has never annoyed Shota more. And you're composed enough to see this through. Shota closes the folder again and places it next to himself on the couch, resigned to his fate. He knows Nezu well enough to know when it's pointless to argue. Shota's right. Hisashi says, sounding both confused and annoyed. Why can't a professional do this? Isn't it their job to be composed? You're right, but Midoriya wouldn't feel like he owes them an explanation quite as much as when it's his own homeroom teacher asking. That's the point of having professionals to it. Shota says, glaring at Nezu. You're manipulating a student who's vulnerable already? Nemuri asks, jaw hanging open. Hisashi looks too frozen in shock to say anything. Due to the current situation, solving the issue as soon as possible is our top priority. And for that we need accurate answers as soon as possible, hence Tsukachi and the stress of having his own teacher do it. If it further aggravates the situation, we'll at least know it did. In order to solve a problem, we need to know what it is. The silence in the room is more telling of the teacher's discomfort with the plan than any amount of protests could be. The principal's rational callousness won't ever stop catching them off guard when they're least expecting it. Hisashi looks ready to attack Nezu, and Nemuri's indignated expression indicates that she's about to start a lecture about how wrong toying with other people's emotions is. Shota has never agreed any more with either of those two possible course of actions. I won't be swayed on this. The principal says, voice finally something resembling stern. We can help Midoriya much quicker like this in the long run. He turns to Shota again before anyone can protest. Can I count on you, Shota? I don't agree with this. I know. Nezu motions at him to go on. Just, I'll do it. He doesn't really have a choice. Wonderful. The rat's back to being cheerful. He claps his paws. I trust that you're competent enough to agree on how you'll proceed the rest of today on your own. We'll have another meeting at the same time tomorrow. He's already on his feet, walking to the door. For now, I have a meeting I need to attend. He's gone, moving faster than Shota's ever seen him. If he didn't know better, he'd say the principal was scared of his own employees attacking him. Considering his colleagues' glares, that fear might be justified. So, Shota draws their attention to himself before they can start running after the rat. When are your free PRDS exactly? In the end, they decide that Hisashi will stay with Midoriya for the first PRD. Nemuri for the second and Shota for the rest of the day. That enhances the chance of Shota being the one there when Midoriya wakes up. Normally, Shota has several other responsibilities to attend to before heroics training, but all of those are negligible. Yagi better have finished and memorized that Teaching for Dummies book. With its help, Shota's sure the man can handle teaching the afternoon lessons alone this time. Shota! This is what happens when you waste time thinking about idiots. They appear out of nowhere. Shota finishes collecting the rest of his lesson plans from his desk's drawer, making sure to place them on top of the psych eval folder. What is it? He asks, not turning around to look at him. His desk needs cleaning. Shota vows to organize. His loose papers after this whole mess becomes a bit less messy. He's starting to sound like his students. Maybe he should drink another cup of coffee. There's a big, bony hand on his shoulder and another waving in front of his face. Yagi's deep, concerned voice is repeating Shota over and over again. What? He snaps, because that sounds more terrifying than Yagi's ringtone. You spaced out for a second there. What do you want? Yagi thankfully decides to take a step back and remove the hand from Shota's shoulder. Despite Yagi's brash, oblivious behavior, he does possess the ability to read the room. Sometimes. Shouldn't you be in class? Shota carefully researched Yagi's schedule before venturing into the teacher's room to collect the equipment necessary, mainly some notes, worksheets, and a sleeping bag, to teach 1A's homeroom first and ethics second in the first 2 PRDS. Yes, but despite his accomplishments and experiences, when you get to know him you realize that the former #1 hero is surprisingly human. Shota has seen him in doubt or desperation many times. Yagi is able to show vulnerability in a way All Might never could. And right now, his behavior is somewhere between nervous schoolgirl and concerned, overbearing mother. I went to see how young Midoriya is doing. Of course he did. Shizenji said no visitors were allowed because his injuries weakened his immune system, but, well, I just wanted to ask you in person how he was doing. How did he get injured? Do you know anything about it? Yagi is tolerable. Shota might even call him a friend on good days. But right now, his idiocy is infuriating. Shota takes a deep breath, reminding himself that worried parents often act like dumbass. I told you how he got injured. In a fight against young Bakugo, I know, but... And then he decided to hide his injuries because he didn't want to miss even a day of school in case of a house arrest. This new information will hopefully be enough to shut him up for a while. The horror on Yagi's face was laughable. Midoriya wouldn't? Shota raised a pointed eyebrow. Yagi sighed, wearing a disappointed but mostly concerned frown on his face. I'll have to talk to him about how to take proper care of himself. Yagi doesn't know how necessary that talk is. There's a difference between hard work and self-destruction. Ignoring how hypocritical that is coming from Yagi, Shota hums approvingly. You're right about that. He wraps his capture scarf around Yagi's torso, not too tightly, careful of the man's injuries. Disregarding his vehement objections, he lifts him in the air and doesn't place him back on his feet until they're out in the hallway. What are you doing? Yagi asks. Even though you clearly favor Midoriya, he expertly ignores Yagi's indignant, I don't. You have an extracurricular third-year class to teach. Put the knowledge in that book of yours to good use. Yagi is still blushing after Shota releases his bindings and leaves for class, but at least he seems determined not to neglect his other students anymore. The members of 1A are a close-knit group. They went through a lot together, and trauma seems to have sped up their bonding process. The members are closer to each other than in any other class Shota had before them. He observed them standing up for and supporting one another, even if some of them aren't the best of friends. Normally, Shota'd say that it's a good thing. But now, being crowded by the entirety of the class moments after entering the room, Shota thinks it's a thing that'll make his doctor frown disapprovingly at his increased caffeine intake. Quiet, he says over their loud voices. Thankfully, their concern didn't make them incapable of following basic instructions. He exhales in relief at the lowered volume. I'll answer your questions one after the other once you take your seats. The speed at which they take their seats is impressive. Several people raise their hands. He calls on Ida, who promptly rises to his feet. Sir, Todoroki told us Midoriya is injured and in the infirmary. He chops his hands, even more erratically than usual. He said he isn't badly injured, but I would like to know why he hasn't returned yet in that case. 19 pairs of eyes are staring at him intently. He wishes they were this attentive in class. Best stick to the same story. Todoroki is right. The only reason why he has to stay at Recovery Girls is because he's in quarantine due to a weakened immune system caused by his injuries. There are some gasps and whispers at this. It isn't anything serious, he'll just have to be isolated for a few days or longer depending on how he's doing. Ida's shoulders relax somewhat at the explanation. There are no visitors allowed during that time, of course. His stern voice seems to have staved off most of the complaints about this, as he expected. His class can be reasonable when it counts. Thank you, sir. Ida sits back down. He exchanges relieved smiles with the surrounding Uraraka and Azui. As he surveys the remaining raised hands, Shota is glad to find that Todoroki doesn't seem to be doing much worse than usual. He's outwardly unemotional, but it isn't the horrified blankness from yesterday. Aside from his red-rimmed eyes that indicate a restless and sleepless night, he seems to have composed himself enough to pretend everything is normal. Yaoyorozu. He calls on her next, considering that he somewhat promised her answers yesterday. How did Midoriya sustain his injuries? The question was bound to be asked, but Shota foolishly hoped he could avoid answering it. But now, seeing these caring, concerned faces directed at him, Shota can't help but think that they deserve an explanation. Even if it isn't the truth. He got injured while training and foolishly didn't tell anyone. Instead of being shocked like one might expect, Midoriya's classmates barely seem surprised at all. It's a testament to how much Shota himself ignored. That's so Deku. Uraraka told Azui. It's just like Midoriya to do that. Kaminari exclaims further up front. He's grinning as if this was just another fun quirk of Midoriya's character. Kirishima shakes his head in fond exasperation in response. Shota's eyes flashing red quickly calms down the commotion. Everyone listen carefully. He says, just to be sure everyone is paying attention. Not taking care of yourself is unacceptable. Not valuing your own lives or well-being for the sake of your goals is unacceptable. Midoriya could have died. He pauses to let that sink in. Judging by the varying levels of horror discernible on his students' faces, they didn't know how serious the situation is. Midoriya could have died because he didn't trust his teachers. He admits out loud for the class' sake. He sighs. I've been strict with you, but only because I want you to succeed. You won't be expelled for injuries no matter how you got them. Even if you did them yourself. As your teachers, it is our responsibility to ensure your well-being. If you have any problems I or any of the other teachers could help with, don't hesitate to come to any of us. Got it? Although most of the kids look shocked, they answer his question with nods or, yes, sir, yes. Some of them even smile at him reassuringly. Dimmed, they're good kids. After class, some of the students come to him to personally ask about Midoriya and the specifics of his injury. Shota tries to placate them as much as possible without giving away most of what actually happened. Most of them leave the classroom. Worried, unsatisfied, and frustrated, but there isn't much Shota can do about that. At the end of ethics, Shota asked Todoroki to stay behind, which is why his presence as one of the last people in the classroom isn't surprising. The scowling blonde in front of his desk, however, is Todoroki's glaring at him from behind as if Bakugo was to blame for everything wrong in the world. The recent murderous tension between the two of them is something that needs to be addressed at some point in the future. Shota gestures at Bakugo to start speaking. Deku didn't get injured in training, did he? Todoroki stiffens in the background with an almost guilty look in his eyes. What makes you say that? Shota asks calmly, not reacting in any way. Bakugo scoffs and crosses his arms defiantly. I'm not FNG stupid. If you're gonna use me as an excuse for the DMN nerd's pathetic state, FNG tell me next time. Todoroki's fists clench at his sides. There's only one person stupid enough to go pestering the students before school even starts. Yagi, Shota said, feeling an intense urge to facepalm or even better, have his palm make contact with a blonde idiot's gaunt face. Did All Might visit Heights Alliance before class? The answer is obvious, but Shota needs to confirm it anyway. Half out his mind asking about the nerd as if he was dying. Bakugo's scowl deepened. Thought I got into a fight with him and lectured me not to do it again. And you pretended you knew what he was talking about? Bakugo shrugged carelessly. Seemed DMN important if the number one is lied to. Shota is impressed with Bakugo's quick thinking. The boy can be logical when he wants to be. More than the former number one hero, that's for sure. Although that isn't too hard. So what's this about? It's nothing I can tell you. Is it about his thighs? His what? Shota asks, nonplussed. Icy Hot said something about his thighs. Bakugo says, a determined look in his eyes. Something about it being my fault. His voice is full of righteous fury and something indecipherable, something rare. This is none of your business, Bakugo. Todoroki spits. His gaze snaps to the other boy. He looks angrier than Shota has ever seen him before, eyes blazing with a fire that burns hotter than anything his quirk could produce. Ha! Bakugo WHPS around, predictably enraged. You wanna fight? Leave it alone, Bakugo. Todoroki's tone of voice is as cold as the burning anger in his eyes is hot. Shota restrains them with his capture scarf before they can start physically attacking each other in the middle of the classroom. Like I said, Bakugo, what happened is a confidential matter. And if you don't want to be expelled, I suggest you keep it so. He says with burning red eyes. His eyes will be especially dry at this rate today. Bakugo scowls at the wall looking sullen and petulant. Hurry up to class. With one last murderous glare in Todoroki's direction, Bakugo stomps away like a spoiled child, which he probably is, come to think of it. As soon as the door closes behind him, Shota releases Todoroki from the restraints. Although I'm burning to know what happened to cause your newfound murderous intentions towards your classmate, there are more important matters we need to discuss. Todoroki straightens up with a serious, determined expression on his face. Anything to help Midoriya. Shota sighed. An entire month of hero work is less stressful than dealing with his bratses, his co-workers', Midoriya's surrogate dads and frankly his own worry. You said Midoriya's been self-harming for years. Recovery Girl only found evidence from recent injuries. Ah. Todoroki looks conflicted. The same way he did yesterday when he was worried about betraying his friend's trust. Remember what I told you yesterday? He hurt himself on his thighs before. I found out he pauses, looking unreasonably guilty again. So I checked his body for injuries. Why didn't Shota think of that before? If Midoriya didn't want to kill himself or risk being discovered, there were better areas on the human body to harm. Midoriya is smart enough to know that. But Shota didn't even consider checking for injuries elsewhere. He didn't want to believe that there were more. It backfired. Like I said yesterday, this isn't your fault. Repeating this is necessary because the look in Todoroki's eyes suggests that it'll take a while for him to believe it. Just tell someone next time. I meant what I said in class, kid. That goes for matters concerning your classmates as well. Yes, sir. But anything else you can tell me about the situation? Todoroki doesn't say much else. He mentions the leg injury that led to the discovery of Midoriya's habit in the first place, which is something Shizenji will have to look into. His guilt at holding talking to the teachers over Midoriya's head is clear as day. Todoroki's honest. Shota can tell that every detail he reveals is the truth and said with the aim to help Midoriya. There is, however, something he decidedly isn't telling him. Several times he opens his mouth to say something that's clearly important to him, but cuts himself off by saying something entirely different. When Todoroki finally stops talking, Shota asks, "Is there anything else you want to tell me? It doesn't have to be about Midoriya's unhealthy coping mechanism." No. Shota sighs and sends him on his way. Shota would like nothing more than to find out what's bothering his student, but he knows that forcing him to reveal even more than he already has would damage the fragile trust Todoroki placed in him by being honest. And Todoroki's distrust is usually written in his every movement and action, similar to Midoriya but different all the same. Besides, if it's about Midoriya, It's likely they'll find out about it later today. Midoriya is small. He is short and his narrow bone structure will make it harder for him to look big and strong than for someone like Yagi, whose body build was made for it. Despite the strength Midoriya has built up over his extensive training, he still looks small instead of strong when his muscles aren't showing. That is a good thing. It can be helpful to have your opponents underestimate you. He is one of the smallest boys in his class, but that isn't the only thing that makes him small. Midoriya himself wants to keep himself as small as possible. Not when villains are around, of course. When on a mission to help someone or to succeed in an exercise, Midoriya is an unstoppable force of determination and stubbornness. The only situations he likes drawing attention to himself is when he shouldn't. But Shota sees how Midoriya keeps his shoulders and head down in the classroom, how he startles at loud noises, hands shaking, how he sometimes looks at his classmates the same way he often looks at his teachers, with eyes that track people's movements and body language as if expecting to be attacked, verbally, physically, or both. Midoriya is anxious and distrustful despite his candid and kind nature. It's gotten better over the months he spent at UA, and Shota is proud of Midoriya for growing more into the hero he wants to become one day. Now, all that growth seems to have been thrown out the window. It's been months since Shota last saw Midoriya look at him with so much fear, or was it resignation? Probably both. A few moments ago, Shota called Midoriya out on pretending to be asleep. He's not sure when the kid woke up, but it was some time before Shota arrived. It's not surprising that Namuri didn't notice it, what with how invested she was in the novel she was reading. Romantic comedies are her favorite genre, and this one was good enough to make her audibly react to certain parts. He envies people who are able to forget about the real world so completely. He wishes he could do it, but reality is too real to be forgotten so easily for him. Namuri probably didn't even hear Midoriya stir or move in bed. She probably wouldn't have heard him if he started yelling. She didn't hear Shota calling out to her until he got in her field of vision. He wanted to lecture her on how to properly supervise a potentially suicidal student, but that could wait for another time. Now, Midoriya is sitting stiffly with his back against the headboard, as far away from Shota as possible. He flinched when Shota called him out on faking sleep and immediately moved to assume this position. His scarred hands are clenched in the blanket draped over his lap. He didn't react to the pain his movements no doubt caused to his injuries. "You're not in trouble." He breaks the silence by saying something that should be obvious, but isn't to the boy in front of him for some reason. Midoriya doesn't quite look him in the eyes, but he raises his head slightly. The kid's eyes are narrowed in thought as he stares at Shota's lips, as if by looking at them he could better prepared for the words they're about to form. "I'm not." He sounds too incredulous for Shota's liking. "Of course not. We don't punish students for mental health issues." Midoriya grimaces at the phrase as if it was an insult. "And we won't punish you for sustaining injuries, no matter what." He might punish students for their behavior or mindset and teach them how to do better, but it's never for asking for help. A hero needs to know when they require assistance. Midoriya falters, not knowing how to respond. "That's kind of you, sensei." "Thank you. It's only natural." Both of them fall silent again. Midoriya starts wringing his hands while staring at them, his head lowered again. Despite having heard that he isn't in trouble, Midoriya still looks ashamed. Shota isn't sure what to say. He doesn't know what to say. Even though he arranged for it to happen, he is woefully unprepared for this conversation. He isn't the right person to have simple conversations with Midoriya, and he will be the one to ask him a series of extremely personal questions later on today. You can come to your teachers with problems. Shota feels like he's unnecessarily repeating himself, but Midoriya is the one who needs to hear this the most, even more than the rest of the class. He momentarily stills in his movements, giving Shota his full attention by forcing himself to look up. He still doesn't make eye contact. "No matter what it is, we're here to listen and help you figure it out. Heroes need to rely on others in some situations." Midoriya smiles, but he seems to do it more for Shota's sake than his own. Shota shifts slightly, bracing himself for what he needs to say. Getting injured in the field can become a liability. Midoriya's shoulders hunch some more. But it is unavoidable when you're a hero. And if you ever get injured, it is a hero's good judgment to ask for help. Midoriya nods mechanically. Getting incapacitated after throwing no more than a few blows and knowing you will be out of commission before the fights begin is a liability for a hero. Midoriya winces. But Midoriya, that isn't something you need to be concerned about anymore. You can use your quirk without having to injure yourself. You saved Eri without sustaining any injuries yourself. With her help. Midoriya says, clearly flustered. That doesn't make it any less impressive. The red on the kid's face only gets darker as he shakes his head. From his own experience and what he heard from others, Shota knows that Midoriya isn't good at accepting compliments. And Shota isn't good at giving them. At least they can share in their discomfort. What I want to say is that you're nowhere near a liability in any situation, even if you do get injured. It happens to everyone, even All Might. I understand. Midoriya says without understanding at all. The kid has always been a people pleaser, often too concerned about what the other person wants to hear to take something away from the conversation for himself. This also applies to self-inflicted injuries. Midoriya lowers his head in shame again. It's especially true for them because they don't make you a liability in any way. The kid's frowning now as if that was the most complicated thing he's ever said. Since they usually don't happen in battle, there are enough time and resources to take care of them without inconveniencing anyone. There are few moments of silence. Shota can't read Midoriya's expression because his face is now hidden beneath his shock of messy green hair. But I made Todoroki worry. He says softly, voice full of regret. He feels bad for something that isn't his fault. I caused unnecessary work for you and Recovery Girl. It happened entirely because I couldn't control myself. He shakes his head in what appears to be contempt. You don't need to say it's no trouble when I know this was my fault. I need to take responsibility for my actions. He bows his head in apology. I'm sorry. Kid, this isn't your fault. Shota tries to sound gentle, but the kid's too confused to pay much attention to it. But you were the one to harm yourself, yes. But Shota knows he needs to tread carefully. Saying the wrong thing is more likely to be fatal than in any other situation. The way other people feel isn't your responsibility. I don't like that you're injuring yourself, but more than anything I wish you would want to stop for your own sake. Midoriya's head WHPS up again. I don't think you realize that you're hurting yourself a lot more than others. Midoriya doesn't value his own well-being enough to be able to do that. It's more troublesome for the people who care about you when they aren't able to help. Finding my student dead would have been a lot worse than finding him in need of medical assistance. I'm sorry. Midoriya says, voice shaking as much as his tangled hands. Weren't you listening? There's nothing to apologize for. Shota stands up to crouch next to Midoriya's bed. He places a hand to his chest to draw his attention. Midoriya stares at the appendage without lifting his head. The only way you can help anyone right now is if you try to help yourself for once. Midoriya finally looks down at him in the eyes. Focus on getting better for yourself. Midoriya's eyes are questioning as they search Shota's. He tries to convey his sincerity as much as he can. Midoriya isn't only small, he's young too. Tentative and wary, vulnerable and innocent. He's never looked younger than he does now, with eyes that look bigger than usual, blown wide in shock and disbelief. Shota isn't sure what Midoriya is so surprised about, but he can admit to himself that his own behavior has been breaking the character of strict teacher today. But Midoriya is his student and it would be illogical not to try to help him. Midoriya's clearly not sure how to react to his words, so he just thanks him with another bow. Shota removes his hand before he can collide with it. It would be great if Midoriya would stop bowing so much. Stop moving around so much. Your injuries still aren't healed. He says sternly, sitting back down in the chair. I'm sorry, sensei. And that confirms that a few words of encouragement aren't enough to change Midoriya's ingrained habits. It probably didn't have much of an impact at all, but it needed to be said. He needed to make some things clear to Midoriya. Knowing might not be the same as understanding, but it's better than nothing. He closes the curtain to let Midoriya change into the fresh clothes Namuri brought from his room. He's glad she chose comfortable sweatpants and a simple shirt instead of anything fancier. For lack of anything better to do, Shota then decides to hold the lessons Midoriya missed in the morning. The thought of not missing out on as much as he expected cheers Midoriya up more than anything he's done so far. Why is he even trying? He should have just thrown more study material at him. Good thing he asked Hisashi for what class 1A will be doing in English today. He lets Midoriya fill out some worksheets that Hisashi agreed to correct later on. Shota even decides to discuss today's heroics training exercises. It's not like he has anything he can do in Midoriya's hospital room beside paperwork and correcting atrocious essays. Shizenji comes in sometime during ethics to perform a few basic examinations. She waves Midoriya's shame-faced apologies away and tells him to work on getting better. Midoriya's face is red again by the time she leaves after telling them that they should take it easy because Midoriya still needs to rest. Learning new things seems to help Midoriya instead of exhausting him, so it should be fine for now. A few moments after they're done, when Shota's waved away Midoriya's thanks and is about to call lunch rush for some food for them, Midoriya speaks up quietly, "So, I'm not expelled then?" He sounds more nervous and scared than at any point in the past few hours, as though voicing these thoughts would make it more likely that they come true. "No, kid, you're not," he says simply, ignoring that he spent several minutes trying to explain this after he arrived. Midoriya isn't stupid, he's just misguided. "Thank you." Shota distracts himself from the unnecessary tears of gratitude in his students' eyes by ordering their lunch. After they finish their meals, he tells Midoriya to sleep at seeing his droopy eyes now that he isn't excited about school material. It's telling of his exhaustion that a stern look is enough to silence his protests. He decides to close the curtains around the kid's bed when he realizes how much another person's presence bothers him when trying to fall asleep. It seems to help. For a few minutes later, Shota can hear the telltale sign of sleep in the form of Midoriya's breaths evening out. Not seeing him wouldn't cause any problems. Unlike Nemuri, Shota is aware of his environment at all times. Correcting the essays reminds him too much of a limp form and blank eyes, so he decides to postpone it for tomorrow. He has enough paperwork to spend his time efficiently, nonetheless. He reaches for his interactions with the police force folder when he sees the edges of the thick, gray ones sticking out from beneath it. He didn't tell Midoriya. He will interrogate him in less than 2 hours and he didn't even tell him. That's a surefire way to lose the trust he managed to build up between them over the past few hours. He'll have to wake him up and tell him soon. Shota wants to kill Nezu by the end of that conversation. Midoriya is smiling and assuring him that it's fine and that he understands while simultaneously hunching further in on himself and putting some more distance between himself and Shota. Midoriya, thankfully, or not, doesn't know about Tsukachi's quirk despite all the time he spends around Yagi. Shota tells him that having a detective on site as supervision is procedure when an unlicensed individual does a psychological evaluation. Midoriya's frown shows the skepticism this explanation deserves but stops questioning him further. It's like Nezu set this up to fail. It's no second later than 4 p.m. when there's a knock on the door. Midoriya sits up even straighter than before, holding himself even more stiffly than this morning. His hands are shaking. Tsukachi shakes their hands in greeting and takes the seat prepared for him. "I'll be taking some notes if that's okay with you." Tsukachi will be the one to document his answers while Shota asks the questions. "Why yes." The first few questions are pretty easy. Like, how do you feel about your performance at school? Or, what is your relationship with your parents and friends like? He glances at Tsukachi's hands under the pretense of looking down at his own papers, but none of Midoriya's answers are lies. Shota pauses momentarily as he reads the next few questions. It's like Nezu wanted to put Midoriya at ease with questions he would answer honestly in any situation just to rip that comfort away all at once with no reprieve. "When did you start engaging in self-harming activities and why?" A few weeks ago. I felt overwhelmed by school." In an email he received about an hour ago, it was explained that Tsukachi's 2 thumbs touching each other is confirmation of a lie. If his pointer fingers are touching too, like they are now, it means that both statements are lies. "Midoriya, Todoroki told me the truth." It's easy enough to explain how Shota is aware of the lies in this case, but he isn't sure how he will explain the rest. Midoriya grimaces. Ah, well, I guess you know the answer then. Shota gestures for him to continue. I started doing it a few years ago. And I guess it was because I felt overwhelmed by my emotions. Despite Todoroki's words, it's shocking to know that Midoriya started cutting himself fresh out of elementary school. The following answers add to the already grave picture that's being painted of Midoriya's struggles, but aren't entirely unexpected after his conversation with Todoroki. Midoriya's been cutting himself several times a week, mostly on his thighs. Midoriya's getting decidedly more uncomfortable. That discomfort only grows with his next question. Do you think of yourself as a burden to your friends and family? No, Tsukachi's thumbs are touching. Yes or no questions are easy enough to manage even without revealing Tsukachi's quirk. Do you think your well-being is less important than other people's? No, his thumbs are touching again. Midoriya's lack of self-worth has been somewhat obvious with the way he's been consistently throwing himself in life-threatening situations for the sake of just about anyone without a care for himself. Still, having it laid out like this makes it so much worse. Do you often feel useless or incapable? No. He shouldn't be surprised at Midoriya lying anymore. He lies when answering most of the following questions that seem to center around confirming self-worth and self-esteem issues. Do you often have little interest or pleasure in doing things? Do you feel nervous, anxious, or on edge regularly? The next few questions appear to be screening Midoriya for signs of GAD or depression. Midoriya shows surprisingly few symptoms of depression, while scoring high on the anxiety-related ones. Then it comes to the most important questions, the only ones Shota agrees the lie detector is necessary for. Do you have plans on killing yourself? These are the only potential symptoms of depression that haven't been addressed yet. And no. Shota waits with bated breath for Tsukachi's fingers to touch, but they don't. He almost exhales in relief audibly. Do you think other people would be better off if you died? No, Shota has to stop himself from telling Midoriya how ridiculous that notion is when he sees Tsukachi's fingers touch. But he can't. Netsu asked them to hide Tsukachi's quirk as long as possible. Have you ever considered taking your own life? No, another lie. Why did you decide against it? Tsukachi turns to him, tilting his head in question. Midoriya waves his hands in denial. You're not a good liar, kid. Midoriya stares at his bedsheets. I didn't want cause trouble for anyone or make my mom sad. Any other reason? Sure. Several. Shota doesn't need to ask him to be more specific because it's a lie. The rest of the questions have similar answers. Midoriya doesn't seem to want to kill himself anytime soon, because despite feeling like a burden to other people, he recognizes that killing himself would hurt them more. It isn't reassuring, but it means that Midoriya isn't actively suicidal. After a few more specific questions on what he will do when left alone after this, Shota is on the last page of the horrible questionnaire. Did you experience anything traumatic that could have led you to resort to such habits? No, this is the first time Tsukachi's pinkies are touching. Tsukachi's quirk isn't only able to distinguish between personal truths and lies, but it also recognizes the objective truth to events in the person's past, even when the person doesn't. It recognizes lies the person themselves doesn't even know are lies. It has access to some of the person's memories that Tsukachi himself can't see. If Shota added a "do you think" to the beginning of that sentence, Tsukachi's quirk would have come to a different conclusion. Shota will give Midoriya the courtesy of not pressing him for answers on past experiences. They've stirred up enough for today, and not even Netsu instructed him on asking questions that aren't on the sheets. Midoriya will work that out with a psychologist. That was it. Tsukachi says, standing up to shake hands again. He smiles at them as he takes his leave. His professionalism is one of the things Shota appreciates about the detective. He knows him well enough to know that despite his collected, unaffected appearance, Tsukachi is affected by the interrogation he was asked to assist on. Who wouldn't be when Midoriya's shame visibly grew with every question? When he hunched in on himself further and avoided looking at their faces more and more? As expected, Midoriya seems have deteriorated over the course of their questioning. Shota hopes that the answers will at least be helpful in the future. Sensei? Midoriya asks quietly without looking up a few minutes after Tsukachi left. Yes. He tries to keep his voice even. Does Tsukachi have a quirk that can tell if someone's lying? Midoriya sounds like he's dreading the answer. Shota isn't surprised that he figured it out. Midoriya is smart and has a knack for quirk analysis. And at some point Shota became too emotionally invested in the answers to care much about being subtle. Yes. Midoriya hides his face behind his hands. I'm sorry, kid. He doesn't try to justify it, because there's no justification. It's fine. He says, voice muffled by his hands. Shota doesn't need a lie-detecting detective to know that isn't true. It's a not your fault I'm pathetic. Shota can hear a sob Midoriya's trying hard to suppress. I don't know what happened to make you feel like everything is your fault, but it isn't healthy. He feels stupid saying that observation out loud. Shota must be more distraught than he thinks if he loses control of himself like this. He clears his throat, preparing to speak, but Midoriya beats him to it. I'm sorry. He's full on crying now, trying hard to hide it from Shota. It's not your fault that we decided to invade your privacy without your consent. He scoots closer to the bed and places his hand on the kid's knee. Seriously, you could sue the school over this. Midoriya just shakes his head. Shota rubs his knee as he cries, trying to offer comfort without overstepping. Please, Midoriya says shakily after cleaning his face with a tissue from the nightstand. He finally looks up, staring at Shota with pleading, teary eyes. Please don't tell anyone else about this. Shota wishes he could grant Midoriya's request, if only to atone for breaking his trust. But he can't. I'm sorry, Midoriya. Midoriya seems to be too exhausted to start crying again, but there are a few stray tears rolling down his cheeks. He wipes at them furiously. You know I can't do that. Your mom needs to know. And the rest of your teachers have to be informed as well so that they can help you. I'm fine. Midoriya says shakily, shaking his head. I don't need help. Helping you is no trouble and needing help doesn't mean you're useless. Shota says bluntly, putting the results of the interrogation to good use by reading Midoriya's thought processes more precisely. The fact that Midoriya doesn't believe him is one of the reasons why he needs help. Shota's made many mistakes with his student, but he vows to make things right in the future. Come on. For now, that means granting him some privacy. Let's get you back to the dorms. What? Midoriya asks, startled. Your classmates aren't back from training yet. You'll have some time alone before they arrive. Things aren't perfect, but there's no reason to keep Midoriya here. It's worth Shizenji's wrath because it has Midoriya smiling at him genuinely the first time today.